The committee will come to order. Ambassador Tai, thank you for joining us today to discuss the Biden administration's trade priorities. As always, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to your home, the Ways and Means Committee. The last time you came before this committee, I was very optimistic about the work that we could accomplish together to deliver some real results for American workers, farmers, and manufacturers. Unfortunately, today, I'm less optimistic, as the administration has continued to pursue a trade agenda that ignores Congress to the detriment of the American worker and American leadership on trade. The Ways and Means Committee has held filled hearings across the United States where we've heard about how the administration has failed to secure our critical supply chains, level the playing field for American farmers and workers, and reassert America's global leadership role. The United States is rapidly losing ground to China. We must act quickly to right the ship and put workers and American job creators at the center of an effective trade agenda. This starts with strict enforcement of all our existing trade agreements, especially the USMCA agreement. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has failed for the last 3 years to hold our trading partners accountable. It took years of congressional engagement to finally get this administration to bring a case against Mexico GMO corn ban. To make matters worse, when I speak to farmers in my home state of Missouri, they often refer to America as the world's breadbasket. But lately, they feel more like the world's cash cow. You can understand my concern when the U.S. agriculture trade deficit reached a staggering $21 billion in 2023. This is even more alarming when you compare it to the years when President Trump was in office, where the average trade surplus for agriculture products was over $5.2 billion. U.S. agriculture producers benefit when the administration aggressively pursues a trade agenda that prioritizes their interest, and when USTR goes to bat for them around the world. USTR must be far more aggressive in protecting the interest of American farmers. Meanwhile, this administration has sat idly by while China continues to spread its malign global influence. You've asked for new tools in that fight, but you haven't even used the tools that you already have. You have failed to enforce the Phase 1 agreement, despite knowing that China is violating its end of the agreement. This administration has pursued no new cases at the WTO, no new Section 301 investigations. To top it off, we are now nearly 6 years into a 4-year review of President Trump's tariffs. Maybe it's time for the Biden administration to just admit that he did something right. The Ways and Means Committee stands ready to hold China accountable for its human rights abuses and predatory trade practices that devastate American jobs and communities. Tomorrow, this committee will advance legislation to make sure that countries like China can no longer use trade tools like de minimis to escape tariffs they rightfully owe. Additionally, we will counter China's growing influence in the Democratic Republic of Congo and its use of forced labor to harvest critical minerals. We will also propose reforms to the GSP program specifically aimed at convincing countries to sever their own ties with China. The administration has also unfortunately chosen to go it alone trade policy that consists of endless dialogues and unenforceable trade frameworks that fail to open new markets to American products and circumvent congressional constitutional authority over trade. A proactive, robust trade agenda that will actually deliver results can only be achieved when USTR and Congress work together, as the Constitution demands. Your efforts to secure critical mineral deals in places like Japan, the EU, UK, and Indonesia have incensed both Republicans and Democrats on this committee as well as in the other chamber. Again, we are left with no option but to advance legislation tomorrow to correct that. The United States should not sit idly by while our workers and companies are taken advantage of. And I am not just talking about China. The European Union and Canada seek to tax and regulate our companies out of existence. This is completely unacceptable. Unfortunately, it is clear the Biden administration's focus has been misplaced. Rather than work to deliver for American workers, farmers, and small businesses, the administration appeases progressive activists to make trade woke and surrenders U.S. leadership on priorities like digital trade. Let me be clear. We would prefer to work closely together to achieve these goals, and it's not too late to start. We remain willing to work with USTR to realign America's trade priorities and look forward to hearing your answers to our questions today. I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, Nil, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let us welcome back Ambassador Tai, certainly one of the most talented and capable negotiators I have met during my long stay here in the Congress. Delightful is the word I think that we would use in terms of her raw talent. Also to point out that the template that she was the lead negotiator on, USMCA, is one of the most important trade agreements, if not the most accomplished ones, again, that has happened in decades. She worked with the Republican president at the time, and a reminder, every Republican on this committee at the time voted for the agreement that she led the negotiations on with Bob Lighthizer on the Republican side. We reached an agreement on rapid response, the rights of organized labor, and environmental concerns. People said it couldn't be done, and all of our Republican colleagues at the time on this committee, as well as 95% of in the House, voted for the legislation that she was the chief negotiator on and whom I spoke with almost every day for months. I saw a headline in the Wall Street Journal recently that generally doesn't lean in the Democratic direction, which said the U.S. economy, quote, is the envy of the world, and it expects to keep powering higher. Much of that has to do, I think, with Joe Biden's vision, and just as importantly, unemployment that has remained under 4% for the last 3+ years. Putting workers and their families first, as Catherine Tai has done, when building an economy from the bottom up and the middle out, putting weight to the phrase, made in America, she has embraced. Through targeted investments, we've supercharged domestic manufacturing, improved supply chain resiliency, all while creating millions of new jobs, 15 million to be exact. For years to come, these successes will continue to unfold, but in the meantime, we also will return to our roots as a maritime nation, bolstering our commercial shipping industry with comprehensive strategies to expand the sector, grow the workforce, and make sure that this is the next frontier of making it America. And I know we will work together on this initiative. Our investment in combating climate change, which is the largest in our nation's history, is already ushering in hundreds of thousands of new good-paying jobs and spreading investments across our country. The success of late has shown how interconnected workers' rights, environmental protections, and a growing economy are. Ensuring that our trade policies support our values, not just spoken but practiced, is critical. I am one who is grateful for Catherine Tai's leadership on these fronts. The future is in front of us, and we all should be very proud of it. As our nation's lead negotiator, you have fought to ensure that, again, that our workers and businesses have the tools they need to compete in today's global economy and strengthen relationship with our allies across the world. Most recently, at the WTO, MC13, you secured an agreement on e-commerce moratorium, and you are making continued progress on fish subsidies, as I noted a moment ago. The other big dimension that this administration and the trade representative have brought to these discussions is enforcement of existing trade agreements. Robustly enforcing our agreements is another way you've put workers at the center of our trade policy. Again, with USMCA standing as the beacon of what's possible for labor, environmental protections that were bipartisan in agreement, we no longer have to be concerned that the very foundation of these agreements can be fractured going forward. I credit much of this success to your vision. We are sure that your efforts will continue on our behalf, and and we want to make sure that we will continue with a values-based trade policy, working together, guided by doing what's right for our people. We might be able to spread opportunity and prosperity for all members of the American family. Thank you, Ambassador, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. Today's sole witness is United States Trade Representative Katherine Tai. The committee has received your written testimony, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. Ambassador Tai, you may begin when you are ready.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of this August committee. Good morning, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the President's trade policy agenda with each and every one of you. The Biden-Harris administration believes strongly that our economic policies should work to strengthen our middle class. In order to give all Americans a fair shot, we need to ensure broad-based access to economic opportunity. And our trade policy should be a tool that works together with our other economic policy tools to reach that goal. Trade policy hasn't always worked this way. To respond to the many changes occurring in the modern economy, the world economy, and the world in general, we must bring a more open mind and be willing to innovate in the way that we approach trade policy by questioning and testing old assumptions, revisiting norms, and thinking creatively and strategically all at the same time. In this new era, we increasingly measure our success and progress by the degree to which we are delivering real benefits to more Americans across our society, no matter where you live or whether you have a college degree. Our approach is one that addresses and advances the interests of all parts of our economy and does not pit Americans against other Americans. Let me give you some examples of what middle-out, bottom-up trade policy looks like. First, we are using trade to empower our workers because we know that they are the backbone of our economy. Their success is our success. This is about building our middle classes together with other countries and not pitting them against each other. This is why we have prioritized strong labor commitments in all of our ongoing trade initiatives, including in our negotiations with Kenya and Taiwan. This is also why we have been so focused on utilizing the USMCA's rapid response mechanism, a key worker-focused feature of the modernized and reformed North American Free Trade Agreement that garnered robust bipartisan support. Since 2021, we have used the rapid response mechanism 22 times at facilities that span various industries from automotive and garments to mining and services. These cases have directly benefited 30,000 workers through new independent unions, new collective bargaining agreements, higher wages, back pay, and reinstatement for wrongful termination. The reason why this matters is because advancing workers' rights abroad strengthens and empowers workers here at home, because only then can they compete fairly and thrive in this global economy. Our enforcement efforts are also motivated by the principle of inclusivity, that is, ensuring that all Americans enjoy the benefits of our trade policies. With respect to the producers and workers in our steel industry, last year, we secured a victory at the WTO that determined the illegality of the retaliatory tariffs that the PRC and Turkey imposed in response to the U.S. Section 232 national security actions on steel and aluminum. Separately, through the USMCA, we are actively championing the interests of our farmers and agricultural producers. We have pursued 2 cases now against Canada's dairy tariff rate quota allocation measures, and we are currently in the midst of challenging Mexico's restrictive measures on biotech corn before a panel. We are also opening markets for hardworking American families and communities, especially our rural communities. Through negotiations, our administration has secured over $21 billion in new agricultural market access in the last 3 years. For example, after the U.S. and India terminated 7 disputes At the WTO last year, India also agreed to remove retaliatory tariffs on several U.S. products. This means improved access for chickpeas, lentils, almonds, walnuts, and apples, benefiting farmers across the country, including Michigan, Oregon, California, and Washington. This means more market access for turkey, duck, blueberries, and cranberries, benefiting our farmers in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Minnesota. Trade should work for all Americans. Our goal is to stop pitting Americans against each other in our trade policy. This is why we are taking unprecedented steps to incorporate more voices into trade policy making. Just as you stay connected with your constituents in your districts, I have made a point of traveling the United States to hear from workers, farmers, and small businesses, and tribal leaders to better understand their hopes and aspirations and learn how trade policy can address them. I am also meeting with civil society and labor leaders, in addition to the big corporations and trade associations that have traditionally had access to USTR. My job is to represent the entirety of the United States economy, not only those that can afford Washington lobbyists. Our vision for a fairer future also applies to the international arena, because it turns out we all want to grow our economies from the middle out and the bottom up. This is what drives our work at the WTO and in our ongoing negotiations, including with Taiwan, Kenya, and the Indo-Pacific. We are focused on economic engagement and collaboration efforts to drive durable economic growth, to build our middle classes together, again, instead of pitting them against each other. Over the course of the last several years, it has become clear that domestically and internationally, we need an economy that is more resilient, as you say, Mr. Chairman. That means supply chains that can adapt and rebound more quickly and easily from shocks and crises. Developing the tools to reduce dependencies and vulnerabilities and incentivize stronger supply chains is a major priority for USTR this year. We are gathering public input and will hold several public hearings on this. This effort will allow us to draw upon a comprehensive set of perspectives and experiences to help us identify and develop more trade policy solutions. Part of this exercise includes developing more effective countermeasures to the PRC's unfair practices and their negative effects on our economy and workers, and I want to end on this note. For many years now, we have seen how the PRC's non-market policies and practices, left unchecked, have devastated many working communities and industries across our country, including many in your districts. Steel, aluminum, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, and critical minerals, just to name a few. As the President said during his State of the Union address, this administration will continue to stand up to the PRC. And we are prepared to use our trade tools in this effort, including through new Section 301 action and our 4-year review of the China Section 301 tariffs, which assesses ways to deploy tariff measures to more effectively and strategically address the harms from China's forced technology transfer policies, such as cyber theft and cyber hacking and related imbalances and inequities in the U.S.-China trade relationship. This is also why I am closely reviewing the Section 301 petition I received last month from 5 national labor unions to initiate an enforcement proceeding to assess the harm to U.S. workers and the shipbuilding industry as a result of the PRC's acts, policies, and practices. This administration is fighting every day to put working families first, rebuild American manufacturing, and strengthen our supply chains. We are using trade to give everyone a fair shot while working with our allies and partners. I want to thank my USTR team serving in Washington, D.C. and around the world for their unwavering devotion and determination to serve all of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session. The committee will convene again tomorrow morning to mark up significant trade legislation, including a GSP reform and renewal bill and a de minimis reform bill. Our GSP bill is the longest renewal in the history and includes updates to counter China and ensure our farmers are treated fairly when they export to GSP countries. Given that USTR administers the GSP program, including enforcing the eligibility criteria, would you agree that having the GSP program back in place will be a useful tool as you advocate for U.S. interest on trade?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. I did see the notification on the markup tomorrow, and our position as the administration is to support the reauthorization of GSP, in particular with appropriate updates to reflect the development goals and the values of the American economy, including human rights, anti-corruption, labor standards, and environmental standards.
I appreciate your perspective on this. I've heard similar views from our colleagues on this committee, including my Democrat friends, which is why this morning, in an effort to make the legislation bipartisan, as it traditionally has been, we have added those provisions, the labor provisions, consistent with USMCA into the GSP legislation. Our de minimis bill makes several important reforms, with the most significant being the exclusion of all products subject to Section 301 trade enforcement tariffs from de minimis eligibility. Do you agree that our trade enforcement is less effective if Section 301 or other trade enforcement tariffs can be ignored through other U.S. trade laws?
Mr. Chairman, I have heard a lot of concerns across our economy from stakeholders, especially in the smaller categories and people producing and selling consumer-facing products, about the challenges that de minimis presents to their competitiveness. And I agree that this is a worthy issue for the Ways and Means Committee to take up.
There still is no end in sight to your legally mandated 4-year review of the China tariffs. For almost 2 years, China is eating our lunch on trade, and the Biden administration is still studying the issue. So your review will run into a 3rd year unless you complete it by the 1st week of May. So will you commit to releasing results by May 3rd?
Mr. Chairman, I was carefully listening to your description of the timelines. We started the 4-year review in September of 2022. And this has been a whole of government effort. It is a tremendously consequential exercise in examining the use of tariff tools in addressing the inequities in the U.S.-China trade relationship, which are significant. So let me just say that we are making progress, and it is my belief that we are very close to the conclusion of this review.
Good. It's just alarming that this administration cannot even complete a mandatory review of this tariff action in a timely way. This raises serious concerns about whether the Biden administration truly recognizes the urgency of the threat that China poses to American workers and businesses and farmers. The U.S. agriculture trade deficit reached a staggering $21 billion in 2023, after running an average trade surplus of over $5.2 billion during the Trump administration. Simply put, the United States is no longer negotiating meaningful market access for American farm exports. Instead of serious agreements, the administration is pursuing so-called dialogues and trade frameworks that lack legal authority and do not even try to address tariffs, which are often the most significant trade barrier our farmers face. Given how important agriculture is to the America's economic vitality, what is the Biden administration doing to open new markets for our farmers and reverse this deficit?
Well, Mr. Chairman, there's so much you've just said that I disagree with, but I'm going to start with the facts, which is in 2019 and 2020, the United States ran agricultural trade deficits of $1.3 billion and $3.7 billion, respectively. I also have to push back on
2018.
Well,
It was a trade
you
surplus.
said, but you said that there were no deficits.
I said an
there are
average
deficits.
of 5.2.
Well, then
over
let's
history.
acknowledge that deficits are not a new phenomenon, and they happened, and they were larger in recent history. But the main point I want to make, and this is the most important one, which is something that I think you and I agree on, which is American farmers and agricultural producers absolutely deserve the championship of our efforts. And that is what we are doing every single day in trying to score wins for American agriculture. We have removed $21 billion in non-tariff barriers, which, by the way, operate along with tariffs to frustrate opportunities for our farmers every single day. We have also, just in the last year, lowered tariffs, that's real market access, on a dozen products in our negotiations and our work bilaterally with India, a significant market that is really important to the work of diversifying opportunities for American farmers. So I really have to push back on your characterization of recent statistics and also our efforts to align our values, which is that American farmers are absolutely a priority for us in our trade policies.
Ambassador Tai, the fact that you will not even admit to a $21 billion deficit last year under your watch on agriculture trade, that's disappointing, because we have a serious problem when it comes to agriculture trade in this country, and it's because USTR and this administration is out to lunch, and they have not been going against Thailand, who has a 50% tariff on U.S. beef. They haven't been going after Kenya, who has 27% tariff on our agriculture products. I can give you a list of countries, Ambassador, I wish that you all would lead on protecting the American farmer. Mr. Nils recognized.
Madam Ambassador, for decades, House Democrats worked to elevate labor standards and to strengthen the enforcement of labor commitments to U.S. trade agreements. And I would suggest that the agricultural states in America have done pretty well with trade agreements, many of which I had supported. I thought that the trade discussions were always pretty bipartisan on this committee, which led to the major achievement of USMCA. But USMCA reflects the culmination of House Democratic work to transform the old NAFTA, which I opposed, into a deal that respects the dignity of workers and contains meaningful labor enforcement provisions. Why don't you elaborate on rapid response mechanisms and other areas of improvement that you have embraced quite effectively, I might add?
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Neal. It is true that we take as one of our most important priorities the serious implementation and enforcement of the USMCA's terms, especially the updated terms of trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. On the rapid response mechanism, which was responsible for winning the credibility of so many members of Congress and for the first time, so many of our labor unions. We have taken that responsibility especially seriously. We have now invoked the mechanism over 20 times. We have concluded the proceedings in about 15 cases. The net result is 30,000 workers directly benefited by our efforts that have resulted in $5 million in real benefits. That's back pay, that's increased benefits, that's raised wages. And with every single one of these measurable wins, we are evening the playing field for American workers who have competed too long against brethren in Mexico, whose rights have been suppressed by a system that has exploited them. So I think it is really actually an important consequence of the renegotiation of the NAFTA, the work that this committee did in renewing the agreement in the USMCA, that through a trade agreement, for the first time in history, we are demonstrating that trade does not need to be conducted in a way that undermines the interests of workers, that trade can lift standards, and trade can improve the prospects of working people. And that is something we are working every day to expand into the rest of our trade practice. But we haven't stopped there, obviously. We have also used the environmental tools in the USMCA to raise concerns and to establish protocols for working with Mexico on, for example, the vaquita and the totoaba. We have also used the USMCA to enforce our expectations of improved market access for U.S. dairy farmers into Canada. And as well, we are in the middle of litigating a case with Mexico on biotech corn policies that are restricting the rightful access of our producers into Mexico. In all of these cases, we are proud to be using the tools that were developed in the renegotiation of this exercise and for forging a new path in trade policy that really does espouse and champion the interests of as broad a base of our economy as possible.
Thank you. Just a reminder, if I could, Ambassador, because I think it's important, that the USMCA, the largest trade agreement in the history of the world, was a bipartisan effort, largely promulgated by this committee, again in a bipartisan manner, endorsed by the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters Union, the United States Chamber of Commerce. 195 Democrats voted for that trade agreement, and 194 Republicans voted for that trade agreement. Yes, we can build into these trade agreements, as you have envisioned, workers' rights, environmental concerns, and do it by both political parties participating in the negotiation. And the outcome, as you've embraced and enforced, has been beneficial to all members of the American family. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I appreciate you taking some time this past week, get a chance to visit. Thank the chairman for putting this on. You know, USMCA, there's plenty of credit to go around. That was an effort. I was chairman at the time of the subcommittee. So a lot of energy, a lot of effort. You did, everybody did. But the thing that I struggle with, there's 7 billion people in the world. We're 350 million. And where do we go from there? It's been 4 years ago. What is the trade agenda to do more in terms of Asia, Europe? Africa should be an easy one. There's a lot of things I can't figure out why we're not doing more in some of these other opportunities, like Kenya, for example, or Switzerland, or Great Britain, or the list goes on of things that we should be doing. Let's take credit, but that was 4 years ago, but let's talk about the trade agenda now and going into the future.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Buchanan. I appreciate this question, which really gets at what are we doing, and perhaps your specific question is on the negotiation agenda. We are taking lessons that we learned in the renegotiation of the NAFTA and the creation of the USMCA and absolutely applying them forward. We have active negotiations going on with the Indo-Pacific countries. That's 13 countries in the Indo-Pacific, with Kenya, with Taiwan. The first part of that negotiation has been enshrined in an agreement that has passed through the Congress, beginning with this committee. One important distinction in terms of the renegotiation of the NAFTA and the negotiations we are undertaking now. The USMCA was built on a renegotiation of an existing free trade agreement. The negotiations we are undertaking now are new agreements with countries with whom we do not have an existing FTA. Therefore, we are taking a different approach, and our approach is built on the basic principle that we should not be pitting Americans against Americans and American sectors against American sectors, and that's why we are building our negotiations out using the building blocks that you see.
Yeah, USMCA, it just seemed like we were all active and engaged, both sides, a lot of meetings, a lot of effort, and I just feel like there's not that intensity, the focus that we should have in terms of the future. Because China is very active all over. Just got back from South America, be in Africa later this year. They're active all over the planet in a sense, and I think it's important we're engaged just as well. Let me go back to ag, talk a little bit about our tomato growers. We've lost probably half our business in the last 10 or 15 years. To Mexico primarily, we're in the same time zone in terms of, and it's something we've been talking about for 4 or 5 years. And they're very upset, want to find a way to get to yes on a lot of this stuff, but they just feel like they've been played in terms of pricing and the competition, the way they do business. And I'd like to have the opportunity, what's your thoughts on, where we're at, what we can do? And literally, I think the number is $2.5 billion in imports from Mexico, which was a pittance of that before. They're basically taking a lot of our businesses. Not, I'm all about free trade, but it needs to be fair. And it seems like we've been played on a lot of our vegetables and tomatoes in Florida.
Mr. Buchanan, I think this is a great example of within a sector where a trade agreement is operating in different ways for different parts of that sector, and even for the producers of the same set of goods, which is on seasonal and perishable products. I know that the tomato growers in Florida are getting pinched away, that tomato growers in other parts of the United States are not, because of the proximity to the growing season. This is why Secretary Vilsack and I have been in the process of setting up an advisory committee specifically for these growers, to give them more voice and influence in the development of our trade policies that affect them. And so I am very, very attuned to their concerns, and we are working very hard to enable them to have more pull in the development of those trade policies.
And the advisory committee, I guess that's something they've been waiting on about a year or so, but if there's any way you can accelerate that, and then, so I can ask one more question. I'd love to have you join me with the growers in Florida, where we could sit down and just have a candid conversation. It'd be positive, but try to move from where we're at to where we need to be. Is that something you can do?
Mr. Buchanan, I want to give you confidence that we're very close on the final stages of the advisory committee formation, and yes, I'd be delighted to do that with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your outstanding leadership. I think it's so important that for the first time we have a trade ambassador who understands this is not just about how many widgets are sold, but about the impact of trade on families, on our health, on our environment, and that we cannot leave our trade policy exclusively, solely, to multinational corporations who may not think about those issues. As you know, on the GSP bill, we only got it yesterday, and it's good to hear from the chairman just now another surprise that he may add in a consideration concerning labor. But the failure of their bill to include any environmental standards seems to me to be a real setback from the progress that all of us made under the USMCA. I'd ask you to focus on another aspect of this, and that is the way the lack of environmental standards sometimes harm our company's competitiveness. As you know, we excel at producing clean steel, clean aluminum. Our workers lead the way, and thanks to the CHIPS Act and the climate law, we are advancing even further. But it seems to me that our American manufacturers and workers are competing on a bit of an unequal playing field if countries like India and China can produce the same products without regard to their carbon content. Can you indicate what is being considered in your role to ensure that our industries can maintain their competitiveness?
Thank you so much, Mr. Doggett. I agree with you that in the practice of American trade policy, it has been long settled on a bipartisan basis that labor standards, environmental standards are core to the way that we conduct trade with the rest of the world. To your point about the changing nature of our economics and our consciousness around the need for sustainability in our world economic order, I couldn't agree with you more. This is the reason why we have spent the last over 2 years now negotiating what we're calling the Global Sustainable Arrangement on Steel and Aluminum Trade, beginning with the European Union, with a view to then expanding it to other like-minded countries from there. The concept of this negotiation is to join the forces between the US and the EU markets to create incentives around our combined markets that will incentivize cleaner production and cleaner trade, and also to address the non-market excess capacity that's distorting the world market for incentives for fair trade and fair production. This would fundamentally flip a paradigm for trade, where trade would be about the race to the top, about cleaner over time, more market-based and fairer over time. And that is why we remain committed to our negotiations with the European Union. It is also really important to remember our partnership with Europe begins at the beginning of the European experiment. In 1948, the United States made clear our investment in Europe as part of the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods Project, that the United States and the European Union would come together to defend against non-market autocracies. And that is just as relevant today as it was in 1948.
Well, thank you. That collaboration with our EU allies, I think, is very, very important rather than a go-it-alone approach. Let me ask you also about the criticism that you have received at times concerning drug pricing and the way Big Pharma is handled. Some of the same people on this dais who are always defending Big Pharma in insisting on monopoly, uncontrolled prices, the highest prices in the world for Americans, seem critical when you address fairer pricing rules for drugs. Can you comment on that?
Yes, I think it's really important as we are advancing trade policy to recall that we are actually a critical part of the economic policy tool set, and that trade policies have to work for the American people and be in their interests, their economic interests, their public health interests, exactly as you said.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your leadership. I yield back.
Mr. Smith, the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Tai, for engaging here today. I certainly appreciate the conversation that we set up yesterday. I think you want to focus on solutions too. I respect that. That's certainly my goal. Point of clarification, on the 4-year review of the 301 tariffs, when that 4 years, when did that clock start? Was it 2018 or 2022?
So this is a fair question, and I feel like we should come up with a different term for this review. The 4 years refers to the four-year mark when the tariffs are in effect. So the tariffs began in 2018. At the 4-year mark, a review was triggered by stakeholders who reached out to USTR, and this is under the 301 statute to
Okay,
say,
so you
"We'd like
wouldn't
to
characterize this review as being at all late?
Sorry, linked to,
The completion of the review,
yes.
would you acknowledge that we're a little behind on having that review ready for public?
So the review began in 2022, in September of 2022. For us, the approach to China is a deliberative, strategic, and thoughtful one, and I have a lot of confidence that we are nearing the end of that review.
Okay, I hope we can get this going so that we can process it, so the American people can process it, so that investors can process it. It's very important. No surprise, I'd like to talk about corn in Mexico. Has the president been briefed on what Mexico is doing with our corn?
Yes, Mr. Smith.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to know that. My research shows that the president has had exactly nothing to say about what's taking place. That's disappointing. It would lead most reasonable people to believe that it's not a priority. It doesn't matter. Now, it's one thing for me, the representative of the 3rd District of Nebraska, big corn-producing district, to raise some concerns. I'm concerned certainly about my own constituents. I'm also concerned about rules-based trade and the perception that Mexico is getting a pass on this. The filing for the dispute resolution was roughly 2 years after the decree. The flagrant violation of USMCA was made. And perhaps there were some efforts to work something out to try to push back. I can't speak to those details. I've not been privy to those details. And there's folks who would characterize the decree went from bad to worse before it perhaps got better, but certainly not resolved. And I'm concerned that our president has had exactly nothing to say. Is there a downside to our president speaking up and saying that what Mexico is doing with our corn is wrong? Is there a downside to that?
Well, Mr. Smith, I am the U.S. trade representative in President Biden's cabinet, and I am here to talk about the president's trade policy agenda today. And I'm telling you that we are actively pursuing litigation with Mexico using the tools of the USMCA precisely to address what we consider to be an illegitimate and unscientifically based restriction on our trade in biotech corn to Mexico.
I understand that. You're a member of the cabinet. I appreciate that. I think that's important, that trade has a seat at the table. Looking at what President Biden has said publicly about various issues, and what he has chosen, apparently, you're telling me that he has chosen to remain silent on this issue. I don't accept that as being concerned about the issue. And I respect you and your efforts and your team here, very capable of filing the dispute, even though it's been slow-walked, and Mexico answers that with slow-walking their responses in their interest. Okay, fine. But there seems to be an acceptance by President Joe Biden of what is happening. That's disappointing, it's frustrating, and that's on top of the fact that we've basically announced to the world that we're not interested in market access, we're not really interested. I mean, take Kenya, for example. They're members of AGOA. AGOA is a good thing, means different things to different countries in Africa. Kenya, for example, they have the benefits, the unilateral benefits of AGOA, but they would love a trade agreement with us where we could negotiate market access, reducing those tariffs the chairman spoke about, and we've walked that back. Any effort that was made previously, we've actually walked backwards. We're losing ground. I'm concerned. I yield back.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Ambassador Tai, it's great to see you. Thank you and welcome back to the Ways and Means Committee. I want to start by echoing Chairman Neal's remarks about the great work you did in regard to USMCA. You know, I was fortunate enough to be able to work with you. I was on that negotiating group appointed by Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Neal, and I got to tell you, you were remarkable, and it was an honor to be there with you, and it was like taking a graduate course in trade negotiation, so thank you very much. This is a very timely appearance in this committee because we're going to be marking up the bills that Chairman Smith talked about earlier, and I'm glad that we have a de minimis bill and a GSP bill. I know we didn't get the material long ago, but in the review that we've been able to do, I know we have some concerns on our side, so I would hope, Chairman Smith, that we can get an agreement to work together with you, because these are two areas that are extremely important to all of us. And I also want to mention that our economy has made great strides in recovering from the pandemic by creating more than 15 million jobs under the Biden administration. And through strong domestic investments in our transportation infrastructure, green energy economy, and microchip manufacturing, we've seen an extended period of unemployment under 4%. And that's important and has been pointed out by news agencies across the board. We are the envy of the rest of the world in our recovery from the pandemic, and that is in large part because of the great work that the Biden administration is doing. And we know that a strong trade agenda both creates new jobs in America and protects jobs at home from unfair foreign competition. And you've been doing good work. I don't have to look any further, and I have a big ag district. I don't have to look any further in the great work you did to negotiate down the tariffs in India on a couple of crops that are produced in my district, almonds and walnuts, which is important. I think we still have a lot to do in the wine space, and we need to be, I think, aggressive in the rice area also. That's an area that is always on the bubble. And I think we need to get a good commitment that we're going to deal with the Forced Labor Prevention Act stuff. I know that tomato farmers are very concerned that China is now in that market, and they're producing a lot more than the market suggests that they should be producing. So I would hope that you would take a good, close look at that. And in regard to the trade deficit in agriculture, I just want to be clear that there's a lot of things that create problems in the trade space. For instance, sunflowers are a big crop in my district, and we lost 50% of our export because Russia invaded Ukraine. They're not buying those seeds more. Can you imagine that? We've got a lot of ag people on this dais. If one of your major crops lost 50%, I would suggest that we could, if we want to do something about that, we could fund the legislation that's hopefully going to be on the floor this week that will provide some protection to our trade allies. So, Madam Chair, I hope you could give us some indication of what the next move is in reducing wine tariffs. And on the de minimis issue, there's a lot of products coming into the United States that are creating problems. And I spoke with you recently about the products in the bicycle area. There's a lot of consumers that are put at risk because the de minimis rule is allowing unsafe products to come in, especially in the electric bicycle area and bicycle helmets. So anything you could tell us on that would be helpful. And again, thank you for your great work.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Thompson. Yes, with respect to concerns on enforcing the integrity of our trade programs at the border, I think that that is a significant issue, and there are a lot of challenges that we face there together as an administration and Congress that really will require Congress's leadership. So I'm encouraged that de minimis is coming up in committee. We will be watching this very closely. I think that, you know, the only thing I would add is we do see concerns around evasion and transshipment across the board with respect to enforcing the integrity of our trade programs, our trade enforcement actions. That is something that I would encourage the committee to look very, very closely at.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tai, it's really good to see you. And I know we all say it's good to see you, but I truly mean it. It is good to see you. And I think you do one heck of a job. One of the questions I've had over the years, and you and I have talked about it before, because it's actually a combination Department of Energy and Trade, and it comes down to a product called grain-oriented electric steel, the sole producer, by the way, and it is in my best interest because it's made in the town I live in, but it's also in the best interest of America. As you know, the grain-oriented electric steel is the steel that's used inside the transformers that push the electric current from one section to another and control it. But Mexico has gone through the process now of importing steel from someplace else in the world, grain-oriented electric steel. They take the coil, they slit it in Mexico, and they send it to the United States. They say, well, no, it's an American product because it's actually assembled in the United States. But we see so much of that in the business I'm in. If you look to the lower right side of any sticker on a car, it tells you exactly where everything comes from that is made in the production of that vehicle. But in this case, this grain-oriented electric steel, and again, Department of Energy making a decision that somehow we should abandon that and go to something called amorphous. We have one producer of grain-oriented electric steel in America. We have one very small producer of amorphous steel in America, and the rest would have to be coming from outside to come into America. And I think that the concern is that while we know this is going on, why do we continue to let it go on? There's great opportunities, there's great production capabilities in America. Why would we ever be just kind of turning a blind eye to our neighbor to the south to go ahead and bring this steel in, slit it, and then send it to us? To me, is beyond anybody's wisdom. I think if we didn't learn anything from the pandemic, it's the global supply chain. What else can we do to alert the rest of our, not only our country, but let Mexico know? We know what you're doing. You need to stop doing this. They were able to get away from some of the sanctions that the Trump administration were putting in because they would say, oh, no, we're not going to do that. But they've circumvented that. They have done an incredible job of getting around that issue. Just from your perspective and what you've seen, what else can we do, and where is the enforcement if Mexico continues to do what it does? It weakens our supply chain, makes it almost non-usable anymore. Where can we go from there, and how can we get Mexico to actually participate the way they were supposed to participate? And what they asked us, please let us get to this point, and we're going to be great partners, which we really need in this hemisphere. So if you can give me any type of an idea, what else can we do from this point on? I know DOE changed its rule to go to amorphous steel here in a little bit over a year, and they changed it. They gave a couple more years for us to stay open. But what is it else that we can do? Because it is this product coming in from other places in the world that's hurting us.
Mr. Kelly, you know, you and I are on the same team with respect to ensuring that our steel producers continue to survive and also can thrive in our economy and in the global economy. Really appreciate this question in terms of what we can do. First, let me assure you that we have, coming out of USTR, an extremely intensive and robust work stream with Mexico on the issue of steel, including this product, but more broadly as well. Concerns around other parties using Mexico as a way to evade and to circumvent our trade programs at the border, and frankly to water down Mexico's own rights in its legitimate trading relationship with us. So first of all, thank you so much for being such a leader and a clear voice on this issue. That helps me, that helps to convey the truth in terms of what my team and I have been sharing with our counterparts in Mexico City, that the concerns here are real, they are present, and they are urgent. And I think beyond that, we were really presenting to the Mexicans that it is within their power and their control to do the right thing in collaboration with us to ensure that U.S.-Mexico trade is benefiting our industries and not others.
Well, listen, I appreciate the help you've given us so far, but I think we have to intensify it. While we have these important discussions and we talk about what we can do, I'd actually start to see us actually doing something that shows them that we're serious about this. We cannot afford, from a national security standpoint, we cannot afford the loss of grain-oriented electric steel in our steel transformers. And for those who don't know, watch the telephone poles as you're driving. Any place you see a gray canister, that's the transformer. That's what moves electricity from one point to the next, and it's absolutely critical for our infrastructure. Ambassador, thank you so much. I look forward to working with you on this.
Mr. Larson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Ambassador Tai, welcome back to the committee. Let me join in the crescendo of accolades directed at you, and rightfully so, for your incredible work that you did in the service of your country here on the Ways and Means Committee and in your current role as ambassador. Ambassador, in your remarks, you talked about empowering workers through trade, and I want to elaborate on that. In my district, we're very proud to have a critical defense manufacturing base. In fact, we power the F-35 with Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines as well. You have done a remarkable job, and here's my question. Can you talk about everything you've done to level the playing field for the American worker, and what else we can do to ensure our workers can compete fairly?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Mr. Larson. We believe that our workers are capable, they're strong, they're productive, they are competitive. Just like our farmers in the ag economy, they want that fair opportunity to compete. And for too long, I think our trade policies have not appropriately seen them or focused benefits on our workers in the formulation and execution of our trade policies. So our home base with respect to what we call a worker-centered trade policy is to always come back to the renegotiation of the NAFTA, the establishment of the USMCA, again, broad bipartisan support, leadership of this particular committee, and this rapid response mechanism, demonstrating that you can do trade in a way that supports the livelihoods and prospects and opportunities for American workers. I think I might also want to take this opportunity to note that while I'm very encouraged that this committee is taking up legislation in particular to look at the reauthorization of lapsed programs. The GSP isn't the only lapsed trade-related program that matters to our economy and to our leadership in the world. That TAA is also an important piece of our trade programs that goes to the level playing field for our workers that also should be taken up, and I would encourage the committee to take them up together. Beyond that, in terms of advancing the interests of our workers, all of our negotiations in the Indo-Pacific, with Kenya, with Taiwan, whether they are developed, advanced economies like Europe and the UK and Japan, or very developing countries, we continue to put the worker piece at the center because it is so critical to the way that we want to do trade policy, which is to build economic opportunity for our workers while also doing trade in a way that allows our partners, especially our developing country partners, to build their middle classes alongside us. So many of the challenges that we've experienced in trade, domestically and internationally, have come because our trade policies have pitted worker against worker, sector against sector. We experience that here in America. We experience that around the world. We are definitely seeing those pressures with respect to our concerns around excess capacity and surges of exports that may come as a result of China's attempts to export its way out of its economic downturn. And I think that this is one of the most critical elements of the trade policy that we are advancing. It is a different kind of trade policy. It is a policy that is aimed at putting America at the center in leading to articulate a way you can do trade that builds your middle and working classes, not at the expense of others, but together.
Well, thank you. Again, as always, you are precise, and I particularly applaud your efforts and in your testimony about your work with Mexico, especially, again, demonstrates how we can empower workers and not pit them against one another and still have the United States excel in an area that we lead the world in. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Schweikert, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Ambassador, I want to move a little more globally and sort of 3 major topics. From what you do and your staff does, how different does the world look right now? We've been collecting a number of articles that show how trade flows have actually changed remarkably quickly post-pandemic. How does that look for renewal, change, updates of trade agreements, arbitration agreements, all the things that go with this? How much of those numbers I'm looking at in those trade flows are actually maybe a bit dodgy? In other words, transshipment, the constant debate we're looking at and data we're looking at coming out of Mexico. If Mexico is now our #1 trading partner, but how much of that is both, shall we say, quite legitimate, they're moving a factory, and how much of it is rebranding of a product that just touches ground? Number 2, I'm going to ask you about currency. As you know, the US dollar has been on a tear. How much does that create headwind for the work you do? And third thing, your opinion on investor protection that we did in USMCA for an American company when Canada, a Canadian business, has substantially better because they can use different trade agreements. Because we've recently had an issue of a number of US concerns functionally having takings from the Mexican government and almost minimal redress as we designed is in the investor protections in USMCA. So first, trade flows and transshipment.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. Your first question, I think, is a really profound one, which is that you are absolutely right. The world today, the world economy today, is very, very different from the one 5 or 7 years ago. There is so much change that is happening on several different levels all at the same time. I think that in my interactions with my counterparts around the world, there is a recognition that this world is different. Where I see challenges for trade representatives, trade ministers like myself is, what are you going to do about it? I think that one of the hardest points of the trade policy conversation today in America and around the world is, how do you adapt to the changes in the world? And from our perspective, in order to lead as the United States, we have to accept that change is happening and we need to get ahead of the change.
But in some ways, that's sort of the point I was hoping you'd go to, is often the language we design our trade agreements on are quite static. And we also, multilateral has become a perverse word here, even though you almost need that type of flexibility in your design. So how do you future-proof?
I think that the key is to really focus on how do trade policy tools apply to making our supply chains more strategic and more resilient. A lot of the fragility that you see in supply chains today, and you're right, we have an extra consciousness around this over the course of the last few years, whether because of the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or all of these events that have broken our supply chains and demonstrated their fragility. We are really conscious of doing that after-action review to examine what has contributed to this fragility. And I think that the key is in new trade arrangements and new trade tools to build towards resilience. I think you're right. I think that there are multilateral elements of this, plurilateral elements of this, but that is going to require a pretty significant change in the way that we approach and talk about trade.
Okay, the flash round, speed round, U.S. currency, how much does that make your job more difficult?
So I always have to start when questions on currency come up to say that it's the Treasury Department and monetary policy. Nevertheless, I will weigh in here to say that it has been for a long time for those working on trade. We know how incredibly powerful currency and currency practices are to trade flows. It is a powerful driver and mover of trade dynamics.
All right, in our last 15 seconds, investor protections for U.S. companies.
So I know about the challenges that a lot of our companies have faced in Mexico, and I'm also aware that some of them have availed themselves of some of these tools that remain in the USMCA. We are tracking the progress very closely.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Ambassador, thank you for being here with us. I appreciate you started by attempting to set the record straight, and in a couple minutes, I'll give you some time to elaborate on that. But I wanted to share some of my initial thoughts. I appreciated the chairman indicating some flexibility on GSP. As you know, we passed something earlier. We've had on the table proposals that are really not out of sync with what the committee overall has approved. And I'm sorry that it's taken this long, but this may be a bright spot in terms of moving forward. We know that we can work together on things that are so critical to our country and our constituents. I am advised that there are no simple trade issues. The more we pull, the interrelationships are profound internally in the United States, challenges in Congress, and of course internationally. And you've been working hard to recover from some of the go-it-alone policies of the previous administration, designating Canada as a national security threat. I imagine you spent a lot of time earlier trying to explain that to our friends and allies. I was pleased that we were able to work together with Ambassador Lighthizer when you were a key staff director to be able to bring these things forward with USMCA that when it was introduced was dead on arrival. But we all worked together, and I appreciate Chairman Thompson reflecting on that interesting process that we were involved with for hours and hours. I think it was worth it. But I am concerned that there are certain items that could be part of a more comprehensive approach. I appreciate your referencing trade adjustment assistance, which would help put us on a level playing field with many of our competitors. I am concerned that we're going to have a proposal on de minimis that basically is surrendering to China. that it does not have strong provisions. It will go away if the tariff policies change. It doesn't deal with fentanyl. And this committee got copies of a letter from 13 Republican attorneys general, and the proposal that's going to be brought forward is silent on that. Doesn't help at all. And I wonder if you could just take a moment to help establish some perspective on these going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Blumenauer. I think on the issue of de minimis, we all know how much time you've invested in examining the existing policy and looking at policy solutions. And so I do know from my own experience working for this committee and also as the trade representative that the details really matter, and whether or not policies will be effective really come down to their architecture. So again, encouraged by the markup and the legislative movement, really take your point, though, that if you're going to solve the problem, it is really important to think through the dimensions of the policy that you put together so that you aren't creating new problems as you attempt to solve old ones.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I would just hope when we turn to this this week that we have that broader context and we don't settle for something that looks cosmetic but doesn't solve the underlying problem. We're all concerned about the influence that China has, its unfair advantage. We all are aware that there are, I forget the latest, billions of uninspected packages that are leaking through this system, and the threats that it poses not just to public safety, but to domestic businesses. And I'm hopeful that we can have the spirit of cooperation, the chairman's concern about being flexible, that we can work that through, because we can do better than to give China a pass on de minimis with the problems to American companies, public safety, and being able to cut back on this billion packages a year and counting that is slipping into the country without oversight, inspection, and tariff. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. Being from West Virginia, you know I am very sensitive to the drug addiction problem that we have. With that, Mr. LaHood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador Tai, good to see you again. Welcome back. Ambassador Tai, I'm the co-chair with Congresswoman Del Benny of the Digital Trade Caucus. And many of us on this side of the aisle have been exceedingly frustrated with the administration's inability to promote a coherent trade agenda. And when we think about digital trade, obviously there's growing concern with the Communist Chinese parties, global economic influence, and their promotion of digital trade policies that run counter to American ideals. These Chinese policies promote censorship and surveillance. They encourage human rights abuses, and they force unwanted technology transfers through initiatives like the Digital Silk Road. Rather than providing a free market alternative to the CCP's digital governance model, this administration sends mixed messages on the global stage by walking back long-held bipartisan digital trade proposals outlined at the World Trade Organization without clearly articulating a policy path forward. Last November, Congresswoman Del Benny and I led a bipartisan letter along with 36 House colleagues to you, underscoring how your decision threatens Americans' leadership and ultimately harms American businesses and workers. This decision, as we mentioned, was made without any sufficient congressional input. So when I mention frustration, Ambassador Tai, we continue to have concerns and frustration with this decision and the successive abandonment of digital trade in IPEF, or to understand what the policy position of the administration is moving forward. Can you tell us, as it relates to the letter and the current position of the administration, Ambassador Tai, and the decision to abandon digital trade, what are the plans for being briefed here in Congress on the plans moving forward?
Mr. LaHood, thank you for raising the issue of digital. I've been looking for an opportunity to address the entire committee on this particular issue because it has generated a lot of heat. Let me begin by saying that it is precisely because of Congress that we are adjusting our approach and policies on what we call digital trade. It is because we see what you are doing up here with respect to addressing the risks and harms that can come from PRC technology policies and how they impact the rights and the interests of Americans and, for example, their data. We have paid attention to the fact that bills have advanced through the House and have passed with respect to TikTok and the concerns around onward transfers of Americans' data to China and access to the PRC government, as well as more recently the data brokers bill that we saw passed on a 414-0 basis. These concerns around the security of Americans' data and where it ends up in the global technological, economic ecosystem is what is animating our approaches to digital trade. The digital trade provisions that you've referenced go to data flows, data localization, and source code as well. They were developed as part of a trade policy that's really rooted in our recognition and our understanding 20 years ago that data is just about facilitating traditional trade transactions. What we have discovered today, and I think you probably know better than many, being the head of the Digital Trade Caucus, today, data is not just something that facilitates traditional trade. Data is the commodity and the thing that has value in and of itself. Data is what is fueling technological advancements, who has access to that data, who can accumulate it, and then fundamentally here in the US Congress, the debates around what is the relationship between Americans and their data? What kind of rights do they have? What kind of rights to security do they have? And it's precisely because of this evolution in understanding what is at stake that we have indicated that these trade policies that treat data in a very straightforward way, in an outdated way, have to be updated to reflect the much, much more complex issues related to Americans' privacy rights, their intellectual property rights, and also their security and our collective national security.
Well, I appreciate that, Ambassador Tai, and I would appreciate more input from the administration in working with the Digital Trade Caucus. I want to pivot just for a second here. Article from Bloomberg related to, this is the title, from April 10th, 2024, Brazil rebuffs U.S. pressure to abandon tariffs on ethanol imports. Can you comment on the current negotiations with Brazil? It's immensely frustrating for our ethanol producers in this country, the current situation with Brazil, and what action is the administration going to take?
Mr. LaHood, I know how much this matters to you and your constituents. This is an issue where we are entirely on the same page. We continue to engage with Brazil. As recently as a couple weeks ago, my chief ag negotiator had a meeting with their agriculture ministry. We continue to work this issue, and I have been given assurance by my counterparts in Brasilia that they understand how important this issue is to us. We are working to find ways to relieve the tensions in this part of our relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. Mr. Pasquale, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, if we can move, Madam Ambassador, 450 tons of bridge out of the Baltimore Harbor, we ought to be able to come together with a trade policy that's looking forward, which we all are talking about, reciprocal in every manner, shape, or form, and labor-friendly. That's going to be a necessity from here on in, and you know it, and that's how we move forward, primarily. Because of the bad actors we've got to deal with, the world we live in today is more fraught and unstable than in quite some time. That instability makes it absolutely critical, in my eyes, for America to reinforce our trade capabilities. The pandemic and its aftershocks were really a wake-up call and are going to be heard for years to come. That America must bring our industrial capacity home and build trade relationships that benefit our country and our allies. The decades of so-called free trade have hollowed out communities and made America too reliant on bad actors who take advantage of this nation. One of my proudest votes in office remains opposing China's entry into the WTO. Since that moment, the Chinese Communist Party has climbed America's back to economic prominence. China and its junior partner, Russia, are directly hostile to the values of the free world and to America specifically. We cannot allow our own economy to bankroll tyrants who wish Americans harm. There are actually some people who are running for president that want to do that, who wish the economy crashes, in their own words. Trade is not just numbers on a sheet. It is interests and it is values. I believe President Biden has prioritized Americans' interests and values. It is essential that you communicate both of these. I got some questions for you. The attacks on freedom and democracy led by China and Russia represent perhaps the challenge of our time. Can you broadly detail how the Biden administration formulates American trade to preserve democracy and combat autocracy? How does illiberalism negatively impact trade?
Mr. Pascrell, thank you for these questions that go to the center of why trade is important and why American leadership in trade is important right now in a very changing world with significant consequences. One of the leading ways in which we are advancing a trade policy that is focused on defending against autocracies is to work with our partners and allies who share a history with us and who share values with us. Open societies, democratic systems, open market-based economies. The challenge is that the global economy is being fundamentally distorted by systems that don't share our values, but also systems that work on a different set of economic logic. We talk a lot about markets and freedoms. The challenge is that at this point in time, the global economy is actually being significantly affected and distorted in ways that freedoms are being impacted. The level of economic coercion and bullying that we see happening with those countries that have the leverage to choke, where they have choke points in supply chains in response to political decisions that they don't like, should be highly concerning. And so whether it's through our work to diversify and de-risk supply chains, or on our work to promote more sustainable, more pro-worker, pro-democracy, pro-economic opportunity trade paradigms and economic frameworks for collaboration, the concerns you have raised animate everything that we are doing to try to change the conversation on trade, which I think for a long time has gotten very complacent. We need to be fundamentally playing a different game, more active defense. We have to be much more conscious about what is at stake and what are the values in our economy and in our societies that we need to safeguard because they are under threat. And I thank you very much for raising those concerns.
And I have all the confidence that you can change the dialogue. Thank you for your service.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you,
President.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquale. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, I thank the ambassador. When I hear you say we need to play more aggressive defense, I think on the opposition, on our adversaries. But it's like watching, I have to say it, my son play basketball at a young age where sometimes they don't know who's offense and who's defense, and their team will sometimes actually play defense on their own team, which is what I believe, Ms. Ambassador, we're doing with our LNG exports and our domestic energy producers. Why would we put a moratorium on trading LNG with our allies? We talked about enriching Vladimir Putin and adversaries. By not trading with Europe, who depends on us now, like we are their greatest exporter of LNG. They were 40% dependent on Russian natural gas in 2021. That's changed. We've exported 3 times the LNG. And by the way, this is just a stat that I'd read. American-produced LNG has 41% lower life cycle emissions than compressed natural gas from Russia. So the environment is better off, our economy is better off, domestic energy producers are better off, but we're enriching Vladimir Putin, and we are putting our allies in Eastern Europe in a untenable situation. I don't understand that. I'll let you respond, but I need to go to an issue that is admittedly parochial in that it affects Texas, and not my district, but South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley. And this may be a little out of your wheelhouse, but I think you can help us. And I'm pleading with you to help us. This goes back to the principle of these treaties and trade deals are only as good as our willingness to enforce them. Whether it's labor issues, environmental issues, we agreed to it. The American people did by sending us here. We cut these deals, and we get taken to the cleaners by our competitors and partners when we don't enforce them. So there's this water treaty since 1944, I'm sure you've heard of this, where we depend on Mexico, based on this agreement, to provide 350,000 cubic acre feet a year to a couple of reservoirs so we can produce irrigated crops in the Rio Grande Valley. It's $1 billion in irrigated crop loss without these resources. And for 4 years, Mexico has failed to deliver. And Monica de la Cruz, God bless her, she is a warrior from the great state of Texas and is a champion and strong voice for her people at a time when they are in desperate need on the heels of a drought with Mexico not complying. And they've just shuttered the last, they grow various crops, citrus, vegetables, but sugar is a big production ag center in the Rio Grande Valley. They just closed the last sugar mill to process the sugar. 500 jobs gone. And it took her 1.5 years to get a meeting with Secretary Blinken. And I recognize there are lots of things going on in the world, but we got to be able to walk and chew gum. Somebody over at the State Department, and maybe with your help, can hold Mexico accountable so that we don't lose any more jobs. This is a self-inflicted wound. We're not talking about a new deal. This shouldn't be that difficult to solve. And it's devastating the Rio Grande Valley. I've got reports that I would submit for the record, Madam Chair, from the Center for North American Studies that talks about the loss of almost $500 million in direct revenue and a much broader overall economic impact. So bless Monica de la Cruz's heart. She has sent, she's a new member, and with the zeal of a new member, she's written letters. She's gotten bipartisan support. She's worked up and down the chain. She's engaged the Mexican officials. And after 1.5 years, she sat across from Secretary Blinken, and it was just so disappointing. It was like, we'll try. No real commitment, no definitive action. Will you please help the Rio Grande Valley
to just get the water that they are owed according to the treaty so we can help produce a safe and affordable supply of food for this country and food security for every American?
Mr. Arrington, thank you for raising this issue with me in this context. I would be delighted to follow up with you and have our staffs connect and see how we can assist.
I know that may have been the longest question wind-up in
I appreciate it.
in history, but it's a very important issue. Thank you for your sincere consideration. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Arrington, and we do without objection accept the article. Mr. Davis, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Tai, thank you for being here with us today. And I want to thank you for continually promoting President Biden's efforts in strengthening the U.S. economy through innovative trade initiatives and work-centered empowerment agreements domestically and internationally. You've been instrumental in securing U.S. supply chains and reducing economic liabilities through affirming existing partnerships and developing new ones around the world. Additionally, as our trade representative, you've embraced President Biden's vision by expanding agricultural opportunities for farmers and producers with more market access. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics on Wednesday, April 10th of this year, it was reported that consumer prices increased by 0.4% in March, and the cost for medical services increased by 0.6%. At the end of May, a number of exclusions from Section 301 tariffs for medical supplies are set to expire. I'm concerned that the lapse of these exclusions, along with other economic factors, have the potential to increase health care costs. Could you share with us your thoughts and plans relative to how we handle these expiring tariffs and the impact they may have?
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for your question and for framing it around the issues that impact Americans as consumers of healthcare services and products. Let me just say broadly that with respect to our review of the existing tariffs and our review of the exclusions, the tariffs are meant to serve a purpose, and that is to help us address the imbalances and inequities in the U.S.-China trade relationship, to motivate China's compliance with respect to the challenges and the harms that were identified in the original Section 301 investigation, and also to encourage our producers to diversify their supplies, and also our producers to give them the space to make a transition to being able to improve their own capacities. So without getting into specifics with respect to this set of exclusions, where I am limited in what I can say right now, I just wanted to acknowledge that the questions that you are raising are exactly the ones that we look at in administering an exclusions process and in reviewing the Section 301 tariffs.
For your attention to that issue, I moan and groan a great deal about what my district does not have, but one of the things that we do have is a pretty solid supply of medical equipment manufacturers, and they are indeed always concerned. So I thank you very much and appreciate your paying serious attention. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Dr. Ferguson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Tai, welcome. Glad to see you again, and thank you for your service to the nation. I know you've taken several questions along this point, but I want to make it again. I'm really frustrated with the lack of movement on GSP. I look at a state like Georgia, and having, we've got about 1.5 million acres of privately owned timber, and about another 1.3 billion in manufacturing sales associated with that. GSP could play a role in that, but it does in so many other ways. It's really important for us to create different supply chains that we have right now, and GSP is one such tool that we can do that with. Can we have your commitment that you will continue to lean in to help us get that across the finish line? And can you speak to the importance of a solid, potentially longer authorization versus a shorter authorization, and what that does to stability in the marketplace?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. GSP is on everybody's mind at the hearing today, because I know you have a markup tomorrow, which is encouraging, because at this point I think GSP has been lapsed for over 3 years. I have a lot of counterparts who raise GSP with me, asking about reauthorization. I always begin my response by tipping my hat to the U.S. Congress, this committee and the Senate Finance Committee in particular, in terms of it being a statutory program that comes from you. That said, the administration is supportive of reauthorization of GSP, of course, with appropriate updates to reflect GSP's purpose as well, to be a trade and development program that enhances the relationship between the United States and many of our developing country trading partners. And so we also support updates to the GSP program that go to those development goals that address human rights, anti-corruption, rule of law, labor standards, environmental standards. I'd be remiss to not mention other lapsed programs, including TAA, which goes to the competitiveness of our workers. But whether it's with respect to technical assistance or other kinds of assistance that we can provide, we at USTR stand ready as always.
Thank you for that. I just feel like it's really important that we work to get this done. Another area that I'm concerned about is digital trade, particularly as it relates to our filmmakers, our music creators, the multi-billion-dollar industry that exists in my home state of Georgia around TV and film production, but also the music industry in the metro Atlanta area. I'm concerned about things like what Canada is potentially doing and how that could negatively impact, trade. But really, if that goes into effect, then that really could have a chilling effect on the creators' incentives to do, to do more. That could affect job creation in the state of Georgia and capital investment there. Can you speak to how you would deal with that issue and how Canada could potentially be discriminating against American producers there?
Dr. Ferguson, the Canadians are very active, so I just wanted to ask a point of clarification.
Yeah.
Is this with respect to the Canadian Digital Services taxes?
It's the Online Streaming Act.
Oh, the Online Streaming Act. I appreciate that. The issues that you raise with respect to impacts on American content creators, our creative industry, jobs in that industry, which are heavily unionized, this provision is something that we are looking at very, very closely. I think what I'd say to you is we remain in close contact with our Canadian counterparts, with the embassy as well, in assessing where they are in their implementation. I believe this Online Streaming Act became law on April 27th, so almost a year ago. It does create an opportunity for Canada to update its definition of Canadian content to better reflect the complex ways in which film, video, and audio content is produced. We would like to see this updating process lead to fair outcomes for U.S. stakeholders.
Yeah, well, I just would like to have your commitment that we're not going to do anything that discriminates against U.S. producers and content creators.
I think that you can rely on us to do that in our conversations with our good friends up north.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. Ms. Sanchez, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and Madam Ambassador, thank you for joining us. I know that you go to extraordinary lengths to make yourself accessible and available. I want to thank you for always being willing to answer questions. And I also want to point out the great work that you have done traveling the country and talking to stakeholders to make sure that our trade agreements are not pitting Americans against Americans and are doing our utmost to boost each sector of our economy. I just want to, before I jump into questioning, I just want to mention GSP has been mentioned a lot today, and I would remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that Democrats support GSP renewal, but trade agreements can create disruptions, and so Democrats are united in saying that we want to see trade adjustment assistance included in the GSP reauthorization because that helps to minimize some of those impacts, yet noticeably the bill that we will be marking up this week does not include trade adjustment assistance. I just wanted to put that into the record. I have to commend you, Ambassador Tai, and the administration for your efforts to advance a new worker-centered trade agenda, because our trade agreements in the past weren't always focused on workers. And our trade policies in the past had only paid lip service to labor rights. But I'm very heartened that our sort of new template for trade moving forward makes sure that workers living abroad are getting decent wages and decent working conditions, and that we're disincentivizing companies in the United States from sending jobs overseas. I know that we have seen the Biden administration's work over the last 3 years in defending workers' rights, both domestically and abroad, and to help U.S. companies compete on a more level playing field in trade. And as a labor lawyer, I'm particularly proud of USTR's success with the rapid response mechanism that we saw in the USMCA. You mentioned that there have been over 22 cases in Mexico supporting nearly 30,000 Mexican workers. And I think that those ambitious and enforceable labor protections like the RRM reflect the changes that many of us here want to see in any new trade agreements moving forward. To that end, Ambassador Tai, can you speak to how you work to ensure that our trading partners eliminate things like forced labor and other worker abuses in their countries or in their supply chains? And then people will say, well, why do we care what happens to workers overseas? How does that benefit U.S. workers?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sanchez. I'll start with that last question and provide an example. In the work that we've done over the years with American auto workers, for instance, we have seen over the past previous decades the amount of American manufacturing that has relocated offshore, and especially when that production goes to jurisdictions where workers do not have a fair shot, where their rights to advocate for themselves are suppressed. What we see is American workers suffer, and the auto workers are particularly articulate on this, which is that in their negotiations that come up every couple years, that they are given deals and told, you can either take this or leave this, because if you don't take it, we're just going to move production to a jurisdiction where workers can't get a fair shake. And so, by ensuring that our trade deals are actually reinforcing and creating opportunities for workers in these other jurisdictions to be able to have that fair shot, to advocate for themselves, to improve their working conditions, we are, in a very direct way, leveling the playing field for America's workers. So that's one key component to what we are doing. The other question that you asked is how do we work with our trading partners to address forced labor in supply chains? And this is something that we have done a lot of work on with the European Union. We do a trade and labor dialogue as part of the Trade and Technology Council, entered into an MOU with the Japanese government in the G7 context. We've advanced this in a lot of our bilateral arrangements. We are working with our trading partners to work with us collaboratively to create measures where they don't have them, to work towards eliminating forced labor from global supply chains. Everyone knows that forced labor has no place in global supply chains. The challenge is that right now our global supply chains are largely unfettered. They don't face a lot of scrutiny. And making that change to create more scrutiny, to create enforcement measures is hard. You can ruffle feathers. You need resources. But we are growing this conversation, including at the WTO, where in May of 2021, we advanced a proposal in the ongoing fishery subsidies negotiations to shine a light on the problem, the scourge of forced labor in the fishing industry, especially on distant water fishing vessels where workers are very far away from land, from communication devices, and are particularly vulnerable to forced labor. We continue to work on that in the WTO context, and we continue to see progress that we are making across the board.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. I just want to mention one thing before I yield back my time.
Time has expired.
The investor-state dispute settlement, but we can talk about that at another time. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Estes, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ambassador Tai, for joining us today. It's always good to talk to you. Unfortunately, I think a lot of our conversation today is centered around things that aren't going well on the trade front. I mean, it seems like over the last 3 years for the Biden administration, we've been having a lot of the same conversations, sharing the same frustrations with very little or no action. This committee, both Republicans and Democrats, are passionate about free and fair trade because we know when it's done right, it boosts our economy and lifts more people out of poverty. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has shown little interest in pursuing meaningful, fair trade agreements that benefit American workers and job creators. Instead, the administration's advanced some of the disastrous proposals coming from the OECD and WTO that are widely panned as detrimental to the United States and our economy. Over the past 3 years, USTR has failed to insist on safeguards for digital trade, which has been brought up before, which will result in a loss of U.S. tax revenue to other countries. By acquiescing to forced tech transfers, localized operations, and data localization, the administration is consenting to WTO proposals that will send U.S. jobs and IP to foreign jurisdictions, decreasing our tax base. In addition, OECD's Pillar 2 project would accelerate the loss of tax revenue because Treasury succeeded the primacy of U.S. international tax system. While I'm especially concerned about the global minimum tax in Pillar 2, I want to step back to Pillar 1. As you know, me and several of the members of the committee have had concerns about proliferation of the discriminatory digital services taxes since 2017, which is why I encouraged the previous administration to engage in the OECD BEPS 2.0 project. As you know, the goal of this project were to eliminate digital service taxes and provide tax certainty and simplicity for businesses in a growing digital economy. Eliminating extraterritorial taxes like DSTs is not a Republican or Democrat issue. My Democrat colleague, Congressman Dan Kildee, and I introduced a resolution in 2020 condemning DSTs. Yet today we're seeing more countries like Canada enact DSTs, and the OECD issued a convoluted 800-page draft deal that leaves more questions than answers. And because of this, it's my belief that Pillar 1 deal now represents a foot in the door to more extraterritorial taxes on successful U.S. businesses. A recent Law 360 article summarizes sentiment from a tax subcommittee earlier this year, saying both Republicans and Democrat members made clear that they oppose digital services taxes, many of which would be eliminated under Pillar 1, but stakeholders raised concerns about the extent to which the convention would protect companies from future measures. The JCT report on Pillar 1, released earlier this year, notes that a plurality of in-scope companies would be from the U.S., and 70%, or $135 billion of Amount A, would come from American companies. Likewise, the U.S. Treasury would forgo between $100 billion and $4.4 billion per year in tax receipts, as we were giving away our taxing rights to other countries. And USTR's negotiation with Canada on a DST that they deemed acceptable is also troubling, be seen as an easy provision for other countries to copy. Ambassador, I've noticed this in previous hearings. The House Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over taxes and trade, should have been involved in the conversations earlier on, and it's simply unacceptable that Pillar 1, as currently negotiated by the Biden administration, risks sending U.S. dollars to foreign treasuries at the expense of American job creators, innovators, and workers. Kansans I represent sent me to this body to put their best interest first, not those of foreign countries seeking to pilfer the U.S. Treasury. In relation to the negotiations with Canada regarding their DST, what would be the threshold for a tax to be determined discriminatory towards the United States? Would it be that 25% of the in-scope businesses were American, or over 50%, over 75%? Where is that threshold in the discussions that you're having?
Mr. Estes, you've compacted a lot of information into your question, and so I promise I will get to it. But first, I have to start with your characterization of what we have done or not done in the context of the WTO. I have to admit I didn't fully understand which topics you were concerned about, but I really do have to stand up for my people and my agency. We work too hard, including at the WTO, which is a very challenging but important institution, to allow for someone like me that leads an agency to accept assertions like that to stand. So I'm just going to put on the record that I object to the characterizations that we are not standing up for American interests or that we are not leading at the WTO. On your question on DSTs, I will have to say that for a lot of it, let me just start with I'm the U.S. Trade Representative and not the U.S. Tax Representative. And a lot of what you are characterizing as a Biden administration approach really is led by the Treasury Department, which I know is subject to Ways and Means jurisdiction. It's just that I'm not the person and we're not the main agency. Your specific question, though, with respect to Canada and discriminatory aspects of Canada's DST, that is where we come into the DST conversation, where DSTs that are proposed and come into the world have discriminatory impacts. That is exactly the question that we engage on, not with Canada, but with a number of other jurisdictions. We have suspended Section 301 actions. We stay in very close contact in understanding what the dynamics are around Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and we look at all the tools that we have with respect to addressing those issues in USTR's purview.
Well, as you know, I only have 5 minutes to ask questions, so covering a lot of material, and it's unfortunate that we can't get to some solutions. So thank you for that, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. Ms. Delbene, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador Tai, it's always great to have you here at the Ways and Means Committee. Thanks for joining us. As I often remind you and pretty much all my colleagues, trade is critical for Washington State's economy. More than 40% of our jobs are tied to trade in industries ranging from agriculture to advanced manufacturing, and our port workers serve as a gateway to the Indo-Pacific, where over half of global economic growth is expected in the next 30 years. And you have notched some key wins for Washington's economy, thank you, such as reopening India's $120 million market for Washington apples. I do worry we're not doing enough to negotiate trade rules that are commercially meaningful, enforceable, supported by Congress, and reflective of the modern day challenges we face as a nation. One area where we need to be doing more is to combat climate change through trade. The Inflation Reduction Act that Democrats passed in 2022 is the most significant federal investment in American history to tackle the climate crisis and is expected to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, in part by investing billions of dollars to reduce emissions across steel, aluminum, and other hard to decarbonize industries. As a result, many businesses across our country are investing in cleaner production processes, but their competitors in certain foreign countries are taking advantage of weaker environmental standards in their own countries to undercut our industries, putting American jobs at risk. And so if we fail to harness America's clear and growing carbon advantage, more jobs in important areas will be lost to countries like China and India, where production is 3 to 4 times as carbon intensive. And so that's why I believe Congress should pass legislation like the Clean Competition Act that I introduced with Senator Whitehouse and a group of House Democrats, including my colleague Congressman Don Beyer, to impose a border fee on energy-intensive imports. The EU has already passed their own carbon border adjustment mechanism, and many other countries are moving forward with their own proposals, including the UK, Canada, Australia, Taiwan, and South Korea. And this is not a partisan idea. Senators Bill Cassidy and Lindsey Graham, both Republicans, have also introduced carbon border legislation, and earlier this year, one of Donald Trump's top trade officials testified in this committee in support of the concept. So this is also very fiscally responsible, as economic modeling in just the steel and aluminum industries has found that a carbon import fee would raise tens of billions of dollars. So, Ambassador, I wondered, how could a carbon border fee level the playing field for American workers and reduce global emissions, in your opinion?
Thank you so much for your leadership on this issue, Congresswoman Del Bene. I agree with you. I think that this is one of the most important changes among many changes that are happening in the global economy, one where the United States is positioned to lead. We have a lot to contribute here. I wanted to start by letting you know that a couple days ago, if not 2 weeks ago, we, USTR, put forward at the WTO communication on climate and trade at the WTO, primarily to try to focus the work at the WTO. There are about a dozen work streams on environment and climate at the WTO. The WTO knows that the solution to our climate challenges is a collective one that involves trade. Thanks to the work that you and your colleagues are doing here, we are able to advance our voice in that conversation to say the United States has a perspective here, and the measures that countries and economies put together at their border to incentivize pro-climate policies and to make trade work have to be able to work with each other, and that we have to respect that we all have different systems and that our measures might look different. But if our goals are the same or similar, there must be a way for us to join forces, and the approaches shouldn't be to penalize each other. So this is one of these areas where we know that there is work that we need to do, that it is a congressional and executive partnership, and the leadership that you are showing in introducing these bills as they advance, as a bipartisan conversation grows and develops here, will further strengthen our ability to engage and to influence the global conversation. It truly is a partnership.
Thank you, Ambassador. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Del Bene. Dr. Ferguson, you're recognized for 5.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Whoops. How did I do that? Dr. Wenstrup.
That's all right.
Sorry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for being here today. And I may be redundant on something here, but I just want to run it by you real quick when it comes to reopening Section 301. My concern is that when we have things that are not a threat to our national security and do no harm to our healthcare system, whatever, we're going to be open to let businesses make their case to import some of those types of products from China.
So thank you, Dr. Wenstrup. I think probably specifically what you're referencing are exclusions programs.
Correct.
Yes. No, we recognize that exclusions programs are particularly important in transitioning from a situation where we have created and are living in vulnerabilities with respect to suppliers to getting us to a place where we are less vulnerable and have more diversified opportunities. So I hear you in terms of the importance of exclusions and their role in the transition that we are making as an economy.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about things that do not engage with our national security. But in that, national health security in particular, I want to talk to you about that because I am concerned about the vulnerability of our supply chain for products critical to our national health security, such as, PPE, generic drugs. If I had known when I served in Iraq as a surgeon that my protective equipment and my medications relied on an adversary, I'm wondering, how did our military get here, but how do we as a country get here? Because it's a threat to all of us, not just our military. So I know you understand that situation. So I'll really just get right to the question. What actions can you take as a U.S. trade rep to help protect Americans and American patients from predatory foreign medical supply manufacturers? I mean, I look at things, it was about 15 years ago, we had 250 Americans die from tainted heparin coming from China. We don't really have the oversight that we would have here. And so but it's not just what can you do as U.S. trade representative, what can you suggest that we do to help secure our supply chain in that region, in that particular topic with medications?
Dr. Wenstrup, extremely important issue, and you're right, trade has an important role to play here, USTR in particular. Obviously, we're not the only ones to the point about tainted heparin. The abilities of our regulators and safety regulators especially come into play. But I wanted to highlight for you and the members of this committee that just about a month ago, USTR published a Federal Register notice. It's a call for public participation. We are looking for robust engagement from your constituents, from across the American economy, from other economies as well, to help us to share their wisdom with us on how they've navigated all the changes in the global economy and all the challenges with the supply chains to survive and also to create resilience. And of the almost 12 sectors that we've identified as being of special interest to us this year, the medical supply chain, API, PPE are right there at the center. What we are hoping will happen over the course of the solicitation for public comment, a series of public hearings, engagement, formal and informal, is to find out from those who are in the supply chain, who do produce, what drives their decisions around production, around contracting for supply. If they're trying to revive and rebuild manufacturing here, what's going to be important incentives for that? How, if we facilitate that, we can prevent offshoring back again? And then how do we make use of the concepts of friendshoring and nearshoring? My desire is to have results of this exercise be informative, not just for USTR, but for this committee as well, to think about what we can do with it.
I'm tracking with you, but we operate so much in silos here. And would you be okay if we held a roundtable and we had those key players all at the table with you, with us, and we really talk through all these things and not necessarily just with 5-minute sound bites, that we actually do that? I mean, this is a serious, dangerous problem that we have to address, and we have to use all of our assets to be able to do better. I mean, Mark Cuban started his own generic company, and for some people, you can get your prescription filled for less than your copay, because he just marks it up 15%. Well, he has the wherewithal to do that, but he's also concerned that he doesn't have the APIs to actually make all these medications free of adversaries. And so I think those are things we need to discuss more openly and bring in sort of a whole of government and whole of the private sector. So if you're up for it, I wouldn't mind organizing a roundtable in that regard.
Dr. Wenstrup, I'd be delighted to do that with you.
Thank you. Yield back.
Ms. Chu.
Ambassador Tai, it's always great to have you back at the Ways and Means Committee. Since last year's trade agenda hearing, the U.S. and Taiwan have signed and Congress approved the Early Harvest Agreement of the U.S.-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade. I commend you and your negotiating team for the progress you've made on this important agreement, and I continue to believe that it should be a first step towards a comprehensive free trade agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan. And I want to thank you for the USTR's continued consultation and transparency with Congress as negotiations on the initiative proceed. I know that the USTR tabled proposed text on the labor, environment, and agricultural proposals earlier this month. Can you elaborate on the status of the negotiations and talk about how USTR will ensure that we have high standards in these areas? And when do you hope to conclude negotiations on the remaining areas of the original negotiating framework?
Congresswoman Chu, I'd be delighted to do so. We remain in intensive talks with our counterparts in Taipei. They are motivated partners in these negotiations. The second agreement that we have taken up with Taiwan does include, the scope is labor, environment, and agriculture, as you noted. On agriculture, it's agricultural rules, science-based approaches to regulating for things like food safety. I'm optimistic about the pace of the negotiations, and I hope that we'll be able to provide you with additional updates very soon.
And Ambassador Tai, as you know, I'm the founder and co-chair, along with Representative Drew Ferguson, of the Bipartisan Creative Rights Caucus in Congress. And that's because the copyright industries are absolutely integral to the local economy in my district. But it's not just Southern California, which of course has Los Angeles and Hollywood. Every district benefits from the creative workforce, and the industry is one of our most important exporters, producing a $10.7 billion trade surplus and supporting nearly 10 million American jobs. That's why it's imperative that the U.S. uphold protections for intellectual property in our trade relationships. This is a critical time for these American industries as they face issues like piracy, efforts by trading partners to discriminate against U.S.-based content, and the ingestion of copyrighted materials for development of artificial intelligence tools. So Ambassador Tai, can you talk about the tools the USTR can take outside of the Special 301 report to promote the robust copyright protections and enforcement needed to address these threats?
Well, Congressman Chu, this Special 301 is an important tool that we have. It also enables us to take up these issues in our bilateral engagements. In a number of our bilateral frameworks, we have dedicated intellectual property working groups. Those go to addressing specific concerns that have come up, to building capacity, to working with our counterparts on issues of piracy, of establishing strong regimes, recognizing intellectual property rights. Since you noted that intellectual property rights are currently also implicated in the development of the most advanced technology models for artificial intelligence, I'll also take a moment to say that the approach that we're taking to data and technology and the intersection with trade is also geared to focusing on the rights of our content creators who are struggling to be recognized and compensated in this incredible race and hunger and appetite for data. And that those types of issues, which are primarily domestic, nevertheless are important to informing the way that we approach our trade negotiations, so that in our trade negotiations we do not accidentally take away space for those questions to be taken up and resolved by legislators like yourself.
Finally, let me just commend you. You are co-chair of the White House Initiative on Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and you created a special trade commission study on workers in underserved communities as a part of your chairmanship, and I thought that was just really great. I yield back.
Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Tai, for being with us today. Let me start by echoing several of my colleagues' comments regarding our disappointment to see digital trade barriers not included in the national trade estimate. However, There's one area that's been brought up previously that I was pleased to see in the NTA, which is the trade barriers that Canada is enacting or has enacted for online music streaming. Many people are surprised to learn that in my district we have companies that provide a lot of services to the live entertainment industry, and particularly concerts in the music industry. We have a big complex of multiple companies called Rocklittits. We also have a thriving live music scene in our area as well. I do, Mr. Chairman, I have 3 articles I'd like to submit to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. One's from iPolitics, one's from The Hill, and one is WSJ. They do a pretty good job of explaining this issue and the impact on American musicians and the holder of music rights. Even talk about how Canada can't afford it. It's going to increase costs in Canada as well. So I'll submit those for the record. So again, serious concerns. It's going to apply quotas on music streaming services that will clearly discriminate against American content to harm American artists and rights holders. What's deeply concerning is how the new law gives Canada's regulators the power to condition market access for music streaming services on making financial contributions into certain government-linked funds that will be used to support creation of Canadian content, again, ultimately restricting cross-border digital trade. We've heard from stakeholders that the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, is planning to require these mandatory financial contributions before even defining specifically what Canadian content means for the purposes of the fund. So it seems not only like an unfair trade practice, but like a backwards process. And I think it's actually part of a troubling pattern of governments and stakeholders around the world seeing American economic success as sort of a piggy bank from which they can extract value to plug holes in their domestic budgets, similar to the DSTs, which, by the way, Canada is also pursuing. So, Ambassador Tai, I strongly encourage USTR's continued engagement with the Canadian government to ensure that we have an outcome that gives equitable access for the U.S. music industry and artists in the Canadian market. And I'd like to get your reaction and like to see if you'll commit to working with us to ensure an outcome that protects fair market competition.
So thank you, Mr. Smucker, and thank you for acknowledging as well that the national trade estimates, which it sounds like you've actually looked at, does actually include digital trade barriers, such as this one. So we are tracking this very closely and engaged. The Online Streaming Act in Canada became law just short of a year ago. The law does create an opportunity for Canada to update its definition of Canadian content to better reflect the complex ways in which film, video, and audio content is produced. We have let the Canadians know that we would like to see this updating process lead to outcomes that are fair for U.S. stakeholders, and we remain engaged and we'd be happy to stay connected with you and your team as well.
Yeah, like I said, this is really important for the district I represent, and so would love to stay engaged and if we can be helpful in any way, but I think this is a really important issue. Secondly, I'm very concerned about the global proliferation of digital service taxes, but I'm equally concerned with the fact that our own administration sees the rise of DSTs around the globe as an opportunity to question if digital innovation born and bred in the U.S. is actually American. And I believe comments like that send the wrong signal to the international community that our administration welcomes their efforts to cut into the share of taxes that companies are paying. So I strongly urge you to pursue aggressive action to ensure that our companies are not discriminated against. And I hope new Section 301 investigations or other tools to respond to DSTs are under consideration. We need to show other countries that there are consequences for unfair practices. And there's only a few seconds left. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Mr. Smucker, let me just say I've taken note of your endorsement of looking at all U.S. trade tools, including Section 301s, with respect to the discriminatory impacts here. And I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Tai, it's always good to see you here. I'm sure it feels nice and refreshing to come home. But, in an increasingly interconnected global community, access to free digital trade is critical to U.S. economic growth and innovation. And preventing digital trade barriers has historically, and it's always been bipartisan. It's also a requirement of the 2015 Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities and Accountability Act, and which directs USTR to, quote, ensure that governments refrain from implementing trade-related measures that impede digital trade in goods and services, restrict cross-border data flows, or require local storage or processing of data, end quote. Yet USTR has continuously failed to protect digital trade. USTR pulled back on its support for digital trade protections at the WTO, sidelined digital trade negotiations in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework deal, and most recently failed to include digital trade barriers in the 2024 National Trade Estimate report on foreign trade barriers. The internet and digital technologies have revolutionized commerce, enabling businesses of all sizes to access global markets and consumers like never before. However, this potential is being undermined by the rise of digital trade barriers imposed by some of our trading partners. These barriers come in various forms, from data localization requirements to discriminatory regulations and censorship measures. They not only stifle innovation and economic growth, but also undermine the competitiveness of American businesses in the digital age. An increasing number of U.S. trading partners are adopting digital restrictions modeled after Chinese laws that hurt American workers and impede foreign market access of U.S. exports, which is why I was greatly concerned to see USTR fail to include the majority of these restrictions in this year's NTE. USTR stated that these exclusions only applied to any barrier that is an effort to regulate in the public interest, ceding these protections to the interests of foreign governments who would undermine the success of American companies, and as a result, the people they employ, is simply unacceptable. Ambassador Tai, will you commit to us today to revisit this issue and to publish a supplement to the 2024 NTE report relisting the barriers that were improperly deleted?
Mr. Hearn, let me explain to you our approach to the National Trade Estimates report. First of all, let me just say I appreciate the scrutiny of the report, which I don't know that the NTE has ever gotten this much play in the public discourse. Thanks to everyone who's talking about it. I hope that you're also reading it, because we produce this report as a statutory requirement every single year. It is a tremendous commitment of USTR and U.S. government resources, and it ought to be read. So I'm going to take this opportunity to explain the development of the NTE over time. When you look at the requirement for the NTE to be created, it is about listing and articulating significant trade barriers that U.S. stakeholders face in our major export markets. It's about looking for opportunities to improve and to overcome export restrictions to our exporter opportunities. Over time, the NTE has become a very, very large catalog of complaints that haven't actually gotten much scrutiny. What we did this year was begin a process of asking our teams to look at the NTE entries and to first ask, the barrier that's being discussed, is it actually a barrier? Do we actually export the product that is of concern? And then also with respect to digital, whether the measure that's being complained about is being erected as a barrier or if it's a regulatory measure that, frankly, we see a lot of bills in Congress trying to address.
Madam Ambassador, if I may reclaim this, I've got one more question I want to ask you regarding the digital commerce. Thank you for your work on that. And obviously, we have people of grave concern. We don't simply make up things up here. I mean, maybe some do, but we're trying to make sure that we're competitive in the future. The WTO estimates that digitally enabled services accounted for 54% of the global services export in 2022, but as digital trade and digitally enabled services increase, so do the proposed regulations. India, Indonesia, and other U.S. trade partners have proposed adoption of customs duties on electronic transmissions, and an issue of great concern for me and many of my colleagues. Do you agree that the countries should impose customs duty on electronic transmissions? And if so, what is your office doing to make the e-commerce moratorium at the WTO permanent?
So the e-commerce moratorium was created in 1998. I talked a little bit earlier about how the U.S. trade policy approach to data issues really began in 2000 when we thought about data as simply a facilitator for traditional trade transactions, and how that's no longer true, that data has become actually where the action is itself. On the e-commerce moratorium, there's a similar stuck-in-time element. It was developed at a time when we talk about electronic transmissions because the relevant transmission was about fax transmissions. The e-commerce transmission related to the technological world where we were still faxing information to each other. And what developed was a norm, a promise of WTO members to each other to say we weren't going to try to impose duties on those transmissions, even though to this day we're not really sure how you would impose a duty on a transmission that you can't see or touch. But as it is now 2024. So, almost, I'm going to do my math, 26 years later, right? Just the reality that we are living in is so far advanced. And so I would just say we have extended the e-commerce moratorium for another 2 years. At the WTO, in terms of the project for WTO reform and modernization, part of it relates to this conversation, which is for those WTO members who do not want to renew the moratorium. I think we need to really challenge them to articulate what is it that they are trying to accomplish. And how does it relate to the moratorium? Because I'm not sure that it does. But there is actually an evolution in just policy debate, policy development at the WTO that is stuck in time that's reflected in this particular effort. And I think that this is one of the areas of WTO reform that we're very committed to. This issue does implicate
Ambassador Tai, we're already over 2 minutes over, so I apologize.
Thank you for that yes answer. I really appreciate it. That was really good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Ambassador Tai. You know my district well. International trade has helped create thousands of jobs in my district, including in the automotive manufacturing sector, as well as agriculture and the forestry sectors. Thanks to the strong economy created by the Biden administration, exports from Alabama grew by 6% last year, totaling over $27 billion in goods and services. Moreover, your worker-centered trade agenda has helped to ensure that the benefits of trade are more equitably shared with working-class Americans. As you know, I'm a very strong advocate for our preference programs, including CBTPA and the Haiti Hope Help Program and AGOA, of course. Last month, I had the privilege to join Chairman Smith on a CODEL to several of the AGOA countries, and I got to see firsthand how important the program is to so many sub-Saharan African countries. AGOA expires in September of 2025, and I think it's critical to reassure AGOA countries and businesses that utilize the program that Congress is committed to reauthorizing AGOA before it expires. However, we also have an opportunity to make important improvements to the program to encourage more economic development, empower women-centered businesses, and provide a more certain future for larger economies. Can you talk about why the AGOA program is so important to the Biden administration's trade agenda? And do you have any recommendations on how we can improve the program?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sewell. I'm very aware of your leadership on these trade and development programs, our preference programs, and I'm really glad that the chairman was able to lead a CODEL to so many different African nations on the continent. AGOA is really important to us. AGOA had its birth in this committee 20-odd years ago, in the early 2000s, if not 2000 itself. It is actually the foundational program for U.S. economic partnership and trade partnership with sub-Saharan Africa. It's the foundation on which we will be able to build and further develop this incredibly important relationship. We all know that by 2050, 1 in 4 human beings on the planet will be African, and that the population will be overwhelmingly young. To your point about the focus on women and youth, unlocking economic opportunity, looking at how trade programs can help with that, we are convinced that the next iteration of AGOA can lean into more tools for unlocking that opportunity. So to your question around what are areas for enhancement, the first is we know in looking at the data that utilization rates have remained relatively low. They're uneven, higher for certain countries, but overall quite low. So the first question is, how can we improve utilization rates? Second question is, there are actually quite a few sub-Saharan African countries that are developing exactly as AGOA hoped. As they increase in their GDP and income levels, the question is presented, what happens when they graduate out of AGOA?
Exactly. I think Kenya is a good point of that. So how can we go about helping to make a smoother transition?
The next version of AGOA should anticipate that there should be a graduate program for AGOA member economies. How do they continue to build on the partnership with the United States as opposed to just dropping off and just becoming another member of the world economy community? Graduation, how do you anticipate graduation? How do you continue the partnership? And then also, since 2000, actually quite recently, the AFCFTA has come into effect. That's the African Continental Free Trade Area. That reflects a desire amongst the countries on the continent itself to better integrate with each other. As we're looking at a renewal of AGOA, I think that we need to be quite conscious about how a program like AGOA can continue to enhance U.S. partnership while also reinforcing and supporting the integration efforts of the countries on the continent itself. And so I think that those are a couple initial thoughts for areas that I think would really benefit for exploration and elaboration in partnership with this committee.
I look forward to working with you on getting this reauthorized.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal. And of course, Ambassador Tai, I always enjoy seeing you. I'm just a little bit grumpier today, so I'll apologize ahead of time, but I have been so disappointed with the feckless trade agenda promoted by President Biden and his administration. Even the meager IPEF agenda fell apart under incredibly light pressure from liberal senators who were more concerned about facing stiff competition in their reelection bids than doing the right thing for their constituents. In our hearing last year, I said that China is eating our lunch when it comes to competing for trade and investment around the world. Unfortunately, they've gone from eating our lunch to eating our breakfast, eating our dinner, and probably our dessert. The United States is losing ground at every step. This administration is more focused on woke, DEI, climate, and other big labor agendas than more meaningful trade policy. And you know I like trade policy. Nothing in this year's National Trade Estimate report gives me confidence that this administration is committed to even the basics of trade. There have been no trade deals, no talks to expand free trade agreements, no export control markets, and no increases in market access under President Biden's leadership. Compared to China's ambitious agenda, the United States is falling behind in every region in the world. China's winning in our backyard of South and Central America. They're building on years of gains in Africa. China is establishing footholds through Central Asia, Middle East, and making inroads with our own European allies. Finally, they are outcompeting us completely in Asia through their Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Ambassador Tai, China has an extremely aggressive trade strategy in the Indo-Pacific, basically their dressed-up trade version of the Belt and Road. They recently concluded that RCEP renegotiations with 15 countries. They're trying to join CPTPP, and they're working to conclude a digital negotiation with some of our closest allies in the region. This has real consequences for our manufacturing companies, our farmers, and our energy producers in my district. If a company in Vietnam wants to import an information and communication technology and service product from the U.S., it pays 35% tariff. If it imports the same thing from China, it's 0. If a company in Cambodia wants to import a dairy product from the U.S., it pays 35.7% tariff. If it imports the same thing in China, it's 0. And if a company in Japan wants to import petroleum from the U.S., it pays 18%. If it imports it from China, it pays 0. Unfortunately, through all of these countries, even though they are in IPEF, it doesn't sound like these issues are on the table. Ambassador Tai, do you think this situation is in our best competitive interest? And if not, why isn't it part of IPEF?
Well, Congresswoman Miller, it's always nice to see you, and I'm sorry you're grumpy, and I'm even more sorry that you cannot see our trade policy, and you've described it as feckless. I think that's entirely unfair, but you are obviously entitled to your opinion and your adjectives. Let me pick up on some of the dynamics that you've identified. It is true that China is a very fierce competitor in the global economy. So let's start there. We have common cause as Americans working on behalf of other Americans. We have stiff competition that we need to rise to the challenge to address. What I would like to do, though, is to have all of us take more confidence in the strength of the American economy and the focus that we are placing on our economic resilience. When you look at our partners in the Indo-Pacific, a lot of what we are trying to do, including in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is to lead on an agenda to help create more resilience for ourselves, but also in partnership with our partners to create more resilience for them. Right now in that region, the supply chains there are so dominated by and so entangled with Chinese economy and the Chinese supply chains. This is a result of the way we've pursued trade policies. Policies like RCEP, like big, comprehensive free trade agreements. They're really in favor of liberalization in a program that has really advantaged the Chinese approach to economic dominance. What we are really laser focused on here at home, and whether it's through USTR, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Treasury, the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, is developing a set of tools and a program for the United States to be able to develop more supply chains that are independent, that run through more different countries, to revitalize our own manufacturing base so that we have more options. In a world that is as volatile and unpredictable as the one that we are in now, we know that we and our allies are better off if we have more options, we have more parallel supply chains. So that's the animating force behind the types of economic engagements, frameworks, agreements that we are negotiating. I know they look different from what came before. But that's really the feature, not the bug, because we need for our economic engagements to produce different outcomes. We need to produce more supply chains that can rebound, more supply chains that run through more places. And that is exactly what we're doing. I'm going to be the first to admit that it's not easy. Getting folks to do something different, to pursue a different program, even when they agree with the objective, is hard work. But that is something where we're only going to succeed if we can work together. I know that you and I share a lot of goals. I hope that we will be able to work together on this set of goals too.
Well, I've already gone over a minute and a half, but I do want to get together with you to talk about Central Asia. Thank you.
Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming today to testify. If I could, I'd like to ask you, back in January of this year, you issued a press release. The USTR releases 2023 review of notorious markets for counterfeiting and privacy. If I could read from it 2 sentences, your quote, quote, "The trade in counterfeit and pirated goods harms workers, consumers, and small businesses, ultimately hurts the U.S. economy. This year's notorious markets list is significant because it underscores the potential dangers of counterfeit goods and why robust enforcement and combat trade in these goods is important in growing our economy from the middle out and the bottom up." So first of all, I appreciate your remarks, and I agree with it. I'm sure everybody here agrees with it. So I represent part of Memphis. And in Memphis, we've got a company called Ampro Industries, led by Jack Sammons. It's headquartered in Memphis, and it manufactures hundreds of hair care products in the U.S. They're shipped around the world. The problem is their flagship line is being counterfeited by the Chinese and sold in foreign markets. If I could, I've got Jake holding this poster board. They make a product called Shine and Jam. That's on the right-hand side. The Chinese make a product called Shine-O and Jam. Same product design, same lettering. And if I could, this really bothers me, we're proud in Memphis to have St. Jude Children's Hospital, great research facility, great employer, great for children and families all around the world. They're a sponsor of this product. The fake Chinese product is St. James Children's Research Hospital. Same logo, by the way, is St. Jude. So as you can see, these products are nearly identical, not necessarily the product, but the design, the labeling, and it's a real problem. So my questions to you are, you see this on a global scale with other products that are being counterfeited. We know what the Chinese are supposed to do as part of the Phase 1 agreement. So, Ambassador, what tools do you have in the toolbox to crack down on stuff like this?
So, Mr. Kustoff, it sounds like this is also a small medium enterprise, and yeah, I continue to have conversations and meetings with these types of really hardworking, inventive entrepreneurs in the American system, and they are exactly who we want to champion and be able to allow them to compete more fiercely. To the bigger question in terms of the China Phase 1 agreement and that underlying Section 301 report and findings around intellectual property rights abuses in China, I would say that those are of a scale that obviously include these types of challenges. The 4-year review that we are undertaking right now, and again, that's a review that was triggered at the 4-year mark of the tariffs, is focused on the question of how effective have the tariffs been in improving China's performance with respect to IP rights abuses and forced tech transfer. We see changes in their laws, but these types of things are continuing to happen. So that review will be one piece of what we are working on. Separately, though, I think that, whether it's at the U.S. International Trade Commission, through the Department of Commerce, the Small Business Administration, there are a lot of other tools that are geared towards helping our smaller enterprises be able to address these types of challenges. The Notorious Markets Report itself is also one of those tools. So let me say this, the challenge is significant, you're absolutely correct. Every single one of our stakeholders matters. Every single one of these types of instances matters. It's a loss, it's an unfair trade practice. We would be happy to connect with this particular stakeholder if we're not already connected to see how we can connect them with more tools.
So, Ambassador, I actually don't think you are. I can make that connection to you with Ampro as it relates to this. I can give them that guidance. Say yes?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Tai, for being here. It's good to see you, of course. Welcome back. You and I have talked about this, so this isn't a surprise to you. Where I come from, mid-Michigan, the term free trade, historically anyway, has been associated with bad trade deals that failed American workers and American growers. NAFTA, for example, our experience was to see our jobs, particularly auto jobs, leave the state, leave the country, and often land in Mexico, being done by folks without any real labor protections and really low wages. Simply put, deals like NAFTA failed the communities that I represent, And that's, of course, been the focus of the work I've done with you and others here. But USMCA, and I think this is really important, has shown us a new way of doing trade. And it, oddly, it sort of put me in a position of being a really strong advocate of this approach to trade, because global trade's a reality. Here's a chance for us to set the rules of the game in a way that requires strong, enforceable labor standards like the rapid response, which I know you referred to in your testimony and answering questions. With our use of this tool, workers in Mexico are being empowered to stand up to protection unions and the multinational companies that have taken advantage of them. So I wonder if you might just, for the folks I represent, talk a bit how we've flipped this race to the bottom to a race to the top, and specifically what USTR is doing to assure that workers across Mexico, which by extension means workers here in the United States, continue to have protections that they need, and how those were only really made available through the work that we have done through USMCA.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kildee. You're absolutely right. I think that the renegotiation of the NAFTA was so extremely challenging precisely because so much support had eroded over time, especially amongst our workers who keep getting pitted against their Mexican brethren, against workers in Mexico who may have rights on paper reflected in the law, but who, because of protection unions, because of the tradition there of collusion between employers and unions, never were able to get a fair shake. The renegotiation of the NAFTA provided us with an opportunity to come up with a new trade regime, a new approach to workers and worker standards in a trade agreement that affects the livelihoods of so many of our workers. It is a really competitive world out there. The rapid response mechanism is actually only available in a trade agreement, and yet it is empowering workers in Mexico that in turn empowers workers here. I would say that for you in your hometown, of the first dozen cases that we brought, about 90% of them were all in the auto supply chain, and that's not an accident. It's because that is one of the industries that suffered the most offshoring and movement from the US and Canada to Mexico. As a result of the use of this mechanism, we have directly benefited 30,000 workers in Mexico. That's resulted in $5 million in back pay that's been retrieved, in improved benefits and increased wages. With every single one of these successes, we are improving the lot of and the playing field for America's workers. Now, the key part of this is that trade policy can't solve this problem alone. We have to be working in concert with our investment policies, with our tax policies across the board. In a lot of the areas that Ways and Means is paramount to ensure that the creation of economic opportunity here in the United States can happen along with the creation of economic opportunity for workers in Mexico, and that by doing things in this way, by strengthening our workers together, we actually make a stronger North America. We make a stronger platform for competing with the rest of the world. The challenge with the direction we were heading before is that if we aren't able to build the strong support, bipartisan, with our working people for our trade policies, that is what threatens American leadership in the world and in the world economy. And so I really thank you for the opportunity to engage with you on this question, because as consequential as it is for your district, I think that that is an indication of how consequential it is for the entire American economy and for our future.
I really appreciate your work on this and look forward to working with you in the remainder of my term here. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Tai, for being here. Ambassador Tai, U.S. digital trade policy has consistently been a bipartisan issue in this chamber and in this Congress, and Congress has remained committed to supporting the promotion of digital trade and the removal of foreign barriers to digital trade that directly harm our companies right here in the United States. And moreover, digital trade bolsters American leadership and encourages innovation and levels the playing field for U.S.-based companies and workers competing against foreign businesses while also promoting democracy abroad. Ambassador Tai, last year, your office made the unilateral decision to withdraw support of the WTO's digital trade principles. I believe this to be an unfortunate decision. I believe it abandoned longstanding bipartisan digital trade principles. It allows communist China to have more of a say over the global rules of the road for internet, for e-commerce, and cross-border data flow rules and information access. And I believe this change in posture by the USTR will hurt U.S. businesses. It will threaten our national security interests if adversaries like China are able to impose national requirements for data localization and get away with harming American businesses at the WTO. So my first question, Ambassador Tai, is why did the administration decide to abandon these principles? And can you explain what steps your office is taking to protect our U.S. companies from foreign government regulation?
Well, I'm glad you raised this, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and you're not the first one to have done it in today's hearing. It is precisely because we are absolutely concerned with U.S. national security, with the security of Americans' privacy rights, the security of their data, that we changed our position on these digital trade provisions. To be more specific, the provisions we're talking about deal with data flows, data localization, and source code. American digital trade policy, first of all, is rooted in an outdated perception that issues of data only relate to facilitating traditional types of trade transactions. That's no longer true. Traditional U.S. digital trade policy has also been reliant on a proxy that what's good for an American digital and technology company is also good for American innovation, which we all care about, American workers, we all care about the strength of the American economy. The challenge is that today it is primarily because of all of the developments in Congress that we've been following. Bills that have passed out of the Congress, like the data brokers bill that came out 414-0 in this Congress in a time where those numbers really speak volumes. With respect to the TikTok legislation that also moved through the House very, very swiftly and with a strong voice. Those are animated by concern around the rights of Americans with respect to their data, their really sensitive data, and where it's going to go, including whether or not it ends up in places like China for surveillance purposes or other purposes that are against their interests. Not changing our approach is what was going to put at risk all of the work that you are doing here to assert the rights of Americans to their data. At the moment, Americans have little to no privacy rights with respect to their data. That is something that I know that the Congress is working to change. Unless we change our approach to digital trade, unless we expand the stakeholder set to go beyond just our biggest companies, we close out the opportunity for those values to be reflected in how we approach these issues.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Tai. I want to shift to tariffs here. The remaining tariff exclusions for China, Section 301 specifically, tariffs, are scheduled to expire May 31st of 2024. If these exclusions are not extended, the reimposition of tariffs will have an impact on United States companies. Moreover, Section 301, this statute requires the Biden administration to conduct a 4-year review of the tariffs, but nearly 2 years later, this review is still incomplete. So when can we expect the release of a 4-year review, and will the review include a final determination regarding tariff exclusions?
I am confident and optimistic that you will see a conclusion of this review soon. And with respect to the exclusions, as they expire on May 31st, the question of what we will do with them will also be answered quite soon. Thank you.
And I just want to end with a statement. The U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship is obviously critical, that we continue to deepen that bilateral trade relationship. I hope that you can continue to work with the committee on that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Tai, for coming today. I know you're probably worn out from the constant questioning, but anyway, I recently met, I have a very coastal district, and I recently met with some fishermen from the district who've been highlighting to me the devastating impact illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is having on the American fishing industry. America's consumption of seafood has steadily increased, mostly because I like it a lot, but that's a different issue. Yet our fishermen continue to struggle, and it is one thing after another. They are dealing already with burdensome domestic regulation, and they just can't compete with other countries. It's unconscionable to me that this administration is literally regulating this industry to death. You know, now fishermen, excuse me, have to install $1.5 million camera on their boats to go out to make sure that they're not the bad guys and catch the wrong fish. These guys, if enacted, will literally be out of business. They can't do it. They can't fish anymore. They can't do it with the cost. I don't understand what sense that makes. We're destroying our domestic industry for the sake of appeasing environmentalists. We go along with the NOAA rule of a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit, and they can't even say if this is going to impact whales or not. And so yet we're allowing China and other countries to destroy not only our environment, but to use forced labor to provide 90+% of the seafood for this country. What have you done, and what have you been able to do to combat the IUU fishing, and what progress has been made to stop this from occurring?
Well, Dr. Murphy, I think you're absolutely right that not just the United States, but the world faces a crisis with respect to the sustainability of fishing, our fish stocks, and the livelihoods of our fishermen. This has been an ongoing subject at the WTO, and so what we have done in 2022, we worked very hard with the 163 other members of the WTO to advance the first part of an agreement at the WTO on fishery subsidies. The IUU fishing issues also extend to unfinished business at the WTO. Our approach is, and it's got to be a collective issue because our oceans and our waters connect all of us. The challenge is to level the playing field by setting international rules that establish what fair practice is and where practices need to be prohibited. This past February in Abu Dhabi, the WTO convened its 13th ministerial conference. My team and I were there for the entirety of the negotiations. We came very, very close to getting this agreement across the finish line. We weren't able to do it for a variety of reasons I'd be happy to brief you on in private, but our work continues urgently and with a lot of commitment. On forced labor as well, you and I are on the same page. In May of 2021, we proposed at the WTO as part of these negotiations a provision that will shine a light on the prevalence of the practice of forced labor, especially on distant water fishing vessels. It's not only not moral, it's an unfair practice, and it's a subsidy. It's an immoral subsidy. We will continue to push for this. We are growing the coalition behind this forced labor provision in the fisheries negotiations, and we remain committed to ensuring that level playing field that, frankly, we all need.
Well, I appreciate that. I would love a briefing on that. I really would like to know what's going behind the scenes, what's preventing that. But, you know, getting back to a further point, Wan Cheese, where Wicked Tuna comes out, if anybody's watched that show, and why those people would go out when the water is 8 and 10 and 12 feet is beyond me. Those guys, they're having to put a $1.5 million camera on them. You can't go any faster you can to get out to the fishing places out at the Big Rock or anything like that, where it takes 2 hours to get out there. Now, if their speed limit is cut by literally a third, it means no fishing. It could be a $200+ billion industry for the United States that's gone overnight. And so I just don't get why this administration is hell-bent on, look, I love the outdoors. I'm from the beach. I absolutely love the outdoors. But there's a balance between what's going on in environmentalists and what's going on with our trade industry and with our fishing industries, and we're being absolutely clobbered by overregulation from this administration. Yield back.
Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Ambassador Tai, thank you for sitting with us for many hours a couple of times a year. Really, you're heroic. Thank you, too, for your eloquence on the data transfer, the digital law stuff. It'd be fascinating to follow up with you later on the implications of understanding that digital workforce is now a matter of commodity rather than simply services, and which I think have lots of implications for not just trade, but taxation and everything else. Also, on all the fishery stuff, it would be wonderful if you could get your friends in the Senate to ratify the law of the sea treaty. It would take us a long way in the right direction in terms of enforcement mechanisms and everything else. I wanted to shift, though, to thank you for you and your team for staying in touch with us about Ethiopia and pursuing reinstatement into AGOA. I understand that their lack of progress on meeting the benchmarks related to ongoing internal conflicts, accountability for human rights violations, removal of barriers to humanitarian operations, access to human rights monitors, that they're ineligible for readmission this year, late last year. What are your current observations on their progress towards these benchmarks?
Mr. Beyer, thank you for continuing your work on this issue. We actually, in the course of the last review, had been tracking a lot of progress and then saw steps backwards again, so that we did not make the decision to bring Ethiopia back into the program at the end of last year's cycle. We remain very, very attuned to developments in Ethiopia with an eye to tracking where progress is being made, where we still need to see more progress. As you know, under the AGOA program, there is the possibility of running an out-of-cycle review so that you don't have to wait the full year. That is always something that is available if it is something that could be helpful. But I think overall, as well, as we look at the renewal of AGOA, this version of AGOA expires in about a year and a half. Looking at the tools that we have is actually really hard once we suspend benefits for a country to bring them back in. But the point is to be able to bring them back in. And I think that Ethiopia is a good example of one experience that we can learn from in thinking about how we might be able to develop more tools under AGOA to maintain and create that motivation to get countries back into the program.
Thank you very much. You know, I, with a number of my colleagues here, visited the WTO a couple of years ago in the midst of all the ongoing, the multi-decade fights over the appellate body. You mentioned that you made more progress in last year than in the previous 20 years. And I was fascinated by noting that it was a shift in emphasis from leading negotiations based on their positions to being asked to identify and share the interests that they want served. Could you explain what that means in English?
Thank you so much, Mr. Beyer, for tracking this very closely, because this is one of the areas that is so important to us. Myself personally, having litigated at the WTO, appreciate how many challenges we have with the dispute settlement system, but also I remain very, very committed to a vision for having a dispute settlement system that's effective, that can be accessed by everyone at the WTO, not just a small handful of the WTO members. The interest-based approach, the negotiations at the WTO, we really endorsed this idea from the beginning because we know we have very, very deep, extensive concerns with how the appellate body was operating before and other aspects of the dispute settlement system. And that if we were to approach these negotiations on dispute settlement reform in the traditional Geneva-based way, where you have to think through what your ideal outcome is, and kind of what you can live with. And then from there, because it's a paper-based exercise, you're incentivized then to dial up every single one of your proposals to 150 or 200, just to be able to survive a negotiation process that involves almost 200 other participants. That, for us, looked like it was going to be a very, very long, tortured, and unsuccessful road to move forward, because we are genuinely, in good faith, interested in a reform project. What we really endorsed and got behind was an approach at the WTO to identify not what your position is, which creates that dynamic of dialing up 150 this way, dialing back 150 this way, and then fighting your way to the middle, but to encourage a conversation that was inclusive, that started not with the question of what's your position, but starts with the question of what is the interest that you want as a WTO member served by a dispute settlement system. And as a result of that approach to the negotiations, we were collectively able to make more progress in 1 year than in the 20 years before of a dispute settlement understanding reform that was run along a positional basis. So I think the most critical question in terms of dispute settlement reform going forward is how do we continue this work? My negotiators, my legal advisors in Geneva have told me that this is the one negotiation area in an institution that is showing a lot of age and brittleness, that is dynamic, where negotiators come and they're actually talking to each other and listening to each other rather than just reading points at each other. So it's tremendously consequential. We're very invested in this process. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Ms. Tinney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Tai, for being here and also for being here another time before with us in our roundtable discussion. It was very helpful. So as you know, and this is an unfortunate situation, last November, the U.S. market access rights for our dairy exporters suffered a shocking setback when the USMCA dispute panel actually ruled that Canada does not have to make changes to its very unfair system regarding the dairy tariff quotas. And despite persistently low fill rates for those quotas and the negative impact that's been having on the use of our being able to make full use of USMCA, at the same time we're seeing a notable surge of dairy protein exports from Canada into this market, despite the USMCA's export disciplines on the Canadian dairy market. My huge concern, I represent New York's 24th district, the largest dairy district in the Northeast, not just New York, in the Northeast, and ever growing, my district. What is the administration doing? What can we do to ensure this fair access to the Canadian markets for our U.S. dairy products at this stage? Because obviously I share almost my entire district is the Canadian border with New York, and it's a critical issue for us, all the way from St. Lawrence Seaway down to Niagara. And this trading partnership is really critical to the economy of my district and also New York State and obviously the Northeast.
Congresswoman, we also were tremendously disappointed in the outcome of that second panel because we had won at the first panel. We also found that Canada's attempts to bring itself into compliance, again, did not translate into more access for our dairy farmers, which is very much our expectation coming into the USMCA. We remain in very, very close touch with our stakeholders and the industry. We are pushing ourselves to think more outside of the box. There are important conversations.
Let me ask you just a couple things, because Chris, I got two other things I want to get to. One of them has to do with steel scrap and also wine. I also represent the Finger Lakes Winery, which is a huge part. Just back to the dairy, though, what can we do? Do we have to renegotiate a trade deal? What other enforcement mechanisms are there? Because they're clearly violating USMCA. Is this something we could take to another court? What can we do legally on this?
All tools are on the table, and there are other partners facing similar challenges who we're talking to.
Great, well, appreciate that. And the next big thing is our U.S. steel producers are among the lowest emitting in the world because they pioneered the development of circular steel making that relies on recycled steel scrap as its primary raw material input. Canadian, European, and other steel industries are now following a similar pathway. However, as many steel producers seek to adopt low emissions technologies that rely more heavily on scrap, several countries are implementing rules that would restrict scrap exports to hoard scrap in their domestic markets. The United States is a significant net exporter of scrap, and our steel industry relies on the free flow of scrap worldwide. Do you agree that these steel scrap export restrictions are detrimental on the U.S. steel industry and to global steel decarbonization efforts? quickly, if I could just have a quick answer on that, and what we can do about it.
I think it's important for us to look at that very closely and scrutinize because the issues that you raise are very important.
Do you think that these are detrimental, some of these restrictions that we've imposed on scrap?
Have been imposed on scrap coming to
Right,
us.
from our side.
You know, if there are concerns from our producers, then it's well worth our.
Yeah, we'd love to talk to you more about that, but thank you. Another thing is, how do we evaluate the impact of this global scrap in terms of restrictions? Are we doing that? Is something in your agency work?
I'm certain that we are looking.
All right, can we just get a follow-up on that? I'd love to have more because it's obviously another important industry along my massive district on the Canadian border. Another thing, the U.S. winemakers have struggled to make inroads, as we've talked about in the past, in key markets around the world. This is due to, again, trade barriers. We've talked about this today, and you've addressed a lot of these issues. Vietnam imposes a 50% tariff on wine from the United States, but will soon eliminate tariffs from competitors in, I believe it's EU, Chile, Australia, New Zealand. India and Australia have also entered into an agreement that will lower the tariff to 75%, later 25% on premium wine from Australia, while U.S. winemakers are faced with a 150% tariff. How can we address this issue? What can we do? And will you please look into this as the USTA? The Finger Lakes wine market is a more nascent market. We're coming up. We've got three wines in the top 100 wines. We're still struggling to get our place, but we're doing a tremendous job. Hundreds and hundreds of wineries in my district, and we really want a chance to compete and get market access. We would just love to have you either visit, advocate, or see what we can do on this tariff situation, which is grossly unfair to U.S. wine producers.
Finger Lakes Riesling is one of my favorite wines. I would gladly take you up on that, but more importantly,
We'll send you a bottle.
we will be delighted to work with your producers very, very closely on looking for opportunities.
Great, thanks so much. We appreciate your service. Thank you.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Tai, thank you for being here. But last time you were with us I guess it was over a year ago, I shared with you the importance of export market development and access to my district. My district is one of the most agricultural dependent districts in the country, and roughly a third of what producers in my district take home in sales comes from exports. Since we spoke, the agricultural trade deficit has not only continued, but is now projected to be at the highest deficit ever. Producers in my district are at a distinct disadvantage as a result of this administration's lack of trade agenda compared to their counterparts across the world. And at this point, Ambassador, I just want to ask, what you can give to my producers in my district that could possibly be construed as a new market access since we've last spoken? Not enforcement of existing agreements and not non-binding frameworks or dialogues. I'm talking about tangible, binding new market access for the farmers in my district. And I do have a couple of other questions, so.
Certainly. Congresswoman, we really prioritize our work for our farmers and our agricultural producers, and we're very proud of the wins that we've been able to secure. A lot of specialty crops, tree nuts, berries, but maybe if you wouldn't mind my asking you in particular what your producers are producing, and that will give me a better sense for where the opportunities are that we're pursuing.
Well, and maybe my next question will help that, but you know, we have corn, we have soybeans, we have sugar beets, we've got, but this one on the per capita pork consumption in Taiwan, I wanted to follow up with that. So that per capita pork consumption in Taiwan ranks near the top globally at over 40 kilograms per person per year. Taiwan has erected a number of technical barriers to trade, including labeling and inspection, limiting U.S. imports to just 16% of total Taiwanese pork imports. How will your engagements with Taiwan address the unjustified restrictions on U.S. pork?
Well, we are currently negotiating the second agreement with Taiwan, which go to labor, environment, and agriculture. On agriculture, the subject of the negotiations are those rules that go to regulations and often take the form of barriers. We are establishing high standard rules for science-based transparent regulatory processes. On pork and beef in particular, these have been long-standing trade irritants with Taiwan. We are leaning in on securing improvements to these particular issues. And they're squarely being presented in the negotiations right now, and be happy to have my team read yours into the latest.
And I would appreciate that. And are these going to be binding and durable? I mean, or are you just?
Well, that is absolutely the intention.
The intention is to
Yes.
have, so, okay, thank you. And then I do have one last question, not about ag, but about another producer or manufacturer in our district. And on May 31st, the remaining exclusions from the China Section 301 tariffs are scheduled to expire. Many American companies rely on these exclusions in order to remain competitive with competition from other imports. These exclusions have been vetted multiple times by both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and this vetting has found that there are no viable alternative sources of supply. What are your plans for those for those exclusions post May 31st?
Those decisions haven't been made yet, but obviously they will need to be made before May 31st. This particular issue has been raised multiple times in the hearing today. We know the level of interest at this committee, and we'll ensure that you all have a heads up.
And so is the intent to continue to provide these exclusions that support American manufacturers?
Well, so I've noted before, the exclusions are meant to be temporary, but they are granted in recognition of a need for a transition period. So it will depend, and that's exactly what we're looking at.
And thank you. And I have just a few more seconds, but I do have other questions, and what I plan on doing is submitting these in writing. So thank you very much. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach. That's been very rare today, so we appreciate you yielding that back. Thank you. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I want to begin by just thanking you on your hard work, both here on the Ways and Means Committee and now with President Biden. I want to thank you for your time here today. On the topic of AGOA, I'm very interested in seeing this act reauthorized that I know many colleagues here today are too. It is an essential tool in our toolbox to uplift impoverished communities in Africa and create mutual beneficial trade networks. Ambassador, in your testimony, you briefly mentioned the importance of exploring other fair trade rules to complement AGOA. Create expansion on what specifically, in other words, follow up on these tools. Talk to us about what tools are you referring to that could be assisting in terms of improving the initiative.
Mr. Evans, I missed the specific, is it, which trade program are you talking about?
Well, you mentioned that there could be other tools to complement AGOA. Can you please explain on that specifically, which other tools could be of assistance in working together to enhance it?
Certainly. Thank you very much for that clarification. Yes. One of the areas where we think is really ripe at this point, 20 years into AGOA, for us to look at is anticipating what happens when economies really reach that middle income level and are ready to graduate from the basic AGOA program. This is informing the engagements and the negotiations that we have been conducting with Kenya, for instance, in the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership. Kenya is one of those leading economies that is coming up on middle income level and was anticipating what happens when they graduate out of AGOA. They would like to continue to grow their relationship with us. We would as well with them. So where do we take this? Part of it is taking those AGOA criteria, which really do reflect a set of U.S. values and U.S. outlook on democratic pluralism, anti-corruption, rule of law, and bringing those into a bilateral relationship. So you see us negotiating those types of content in the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership. We're also building out parameters on labor, environment, agricultural rules, but also in the Kenya negotiations, looking at the topic of inclusivity. From the Kenyan side, from the African continental side, there is this tremendous focus on how to unlock the economic potential of Africa's women and youth, Kenya's women and youth. And I think that this is an area where we as the United States, working with this particular partner, Kenya, are really prepared to innovate in a trade agreement in terms of really thinking about women, youth, other types of groups that our trade policies have traditionally not been focused on, and how to bring them into the trading relationship. So those are some of the tools that we are looking at. If we can prove the concept with Kenya, then we think that we may have a framework for engaging with other AGOA beneficiaries who similarly are on the cusp of graduation. And I think that that is a tremendous way of growing the AGOA program and also doubling down on deepening our relationship with the diverse economies on the African continent.
Back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Steele.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Subi just came in, so I gave him a little look there because I thought I'm missing my turn here. And Mr. Tai, thank you for joining us today. And you know what, just I'm not talking about AGOA, but you know, I just want to concern about the AGOA, that graduating. It's like Mauritius, and their GDP is almost like $21,000. They're very much concerned about that after they graduating, their economy is going to go down. Instead of that, you know, they want to stay. But I don't think that's really fair for staying. So there's one of the tools is maybe FDA, that, you know, certain things that they are actually, like Mauritius has textile and apparels, and then, you know, we can have certain FTA that, you know, between United States and Mauritius. I think it's going to be really helpful instead of not graduating and try to stay in AGOA. So, you know, that's kind of like my idea and when I got it, and it was just a wonderful trip to see how African country is working. But we must, and then, you know, I just want to ask you just one more thing is about the California olive growers. We just briefly talked about it last year, and I mean last week, and I know you are fighting on behalf of our growers, and, you know, whatever Congress stands ready to help as needed, and, you know, we can work together to make sure California olive growers, you know, that they don't have to compete those dumping coming in from Europe. Another pressing issue we learned about COVID was our alarming reliance on the CCP for medical supplies. And the U.S. imports half of its PPE from China and 2/3 of its surgical masks and respirators. Even more dangerous, China dominates numerous aspects of the supply chain, you know, for pharmaceuticals. We rely almost solely on China for imports in ibuprofen and high amount of penicillin. The reliance poses an unacceptable risk to our economic and national security. Congress must adopt policies to start diversifying our medical trade to our allies. I introduced the Medical Supply Chain Resilience Act with my colleague Brad Schneider. This bipartisan legislation will help diversify our medical supply chains by directing USTR to negotiate sectoral agreements with trusted trade partners around the world and lower barriers and align standards with our closest allies in a key sector. So Ambassador Tai, thank you very much for a long time staying here, and thank you for all those answers. I appreciate that. But do you share my concerns about our over-reliance on China for medical supply chains, If so, will you commit to work with me on a strategy that would start aligning our standards and regulations with our closest allies, as well as lowering trade barriers?
Congressman, I do agree with you that over-reliance is a challenge and a vulnerability, and I would be delighted to work with you on this.
Thank you. We talked about this, and I've been always asking the same questions, that I am a strong supporter of the United States and Taiwan economic relationships, and we must do more to deepen bilateral trade relations with Taiwan. You just said, one of the questions that you said, we built Indo-Pacific economic framework to build the stronger resiliency, between Taiwan. And you talked to me regarding a little bit that because Taiwan is not really included in this Indo-Pacific economic framework, and you said some of the countries are very much concerned it's not United States. So can you update committee on where things stand in these talks and what we are actually doing in further to include Taiwan?
Sure. So you've seen the scope of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework trade pillar discussions, and you also see the scope of the first agreement and the second agreements that we're negotiating with Taiwan. You'll see a lot of overlap there, and it's largely because of the consistency of our approach to negotiations, and it's also with a view to ensuring that we have a consistent approach in this particular region. Taiwan has worked very, very closely with us. Of course, this is a bilateral negotiation. We're moving very swiftly. So the first agreement, Congress has already spoken and acted on. The second agreement involves labor, environment, and agricultural provisions. We are making very good progress. I'm hopeful in the coming weeks that we will be able to come back and report to you on further progress. And knowing your interest, we'll make sure that our teams remain in good touch.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, but my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Tai, thank you for coming today. I continue to be concerned over what the trade agenda of this administration looks like. I mean, from my seat, I think most of this committee would say that there's not a trade agenda. What I do see is a laundry list of toothless proposals that do nothing and that have not had the approval of Congress. Ambassador Tai, I'm going to be very blunt. This administration's trade agenda does not exist. The administration is not holding China accountable. Trade enforcement's weak, and we've basically surrendered in areas such as digital trade. Earlier, you said you objected with my colleagues, saying you and your team are standing up to China, particularly at the WTO, but time and time again, actions speak louder than words, and I don't think you can truly defend these policies and honestly say that the USTR is actually pursuing an agenda that wins for America and disadvantages our adversaries. You defended IPEF and actions of the WTO as pushing back against China, but IPEF is a framework. It is not a true free trade deal. I mean, last time you testified, the buzzword was and ah, and this time it's been soon, which is equally as helpful and informative. So the question I've got is, does this administration actually plan to enter into a free trade agreement? And I would ask you to please be specific. Soon is not an answer.
Congresswoman, I disagree with almost everything that you've just said, and I think it's actually a tremendous sign of disrespect that you don't see the trade agenda that is so clearly before you.
Well,
we are not
your
negotiating.
Position,
I'm sorry, you asked me a question. And
as you know, we don't have any of these have real teeth.
Free trade agreements, as we've engaged with them in the past, have pitted Americans against Americans, and we are not doing that anymore.
I retake my time.
Yep, it's the lady's time.
So last year you had
She asked me questions that presumably she wanted me to answer. If she doesn't want me to answer them, I don't need to respond.
It's Mrs. Van Dyne's time.
Last year we had to do this backward to ensure that we actually supported our ally in Taiwan. Is the UTR in this administration intentionally avoiding Congress, and do you really care about the constitutional process? And a yes or no answer would just be great. Okay, non-responsive. We'll send it in a letter. Last summer, you stated that the Biden administration's trade policy is, I quote, turning the colonial mindset on its head. And last November, you opened an APEC meeting by acknowledging that it was being held on the, quote, unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone. I mean, I thought it was called San Francisco, but whatever. Then at a conference in Brussels earlier this year, you called for, quote, breaking out of some of these colonial and post-colonial structures. This entire time, the Biden administration has not lifted a finger to enforce China's violations of the Phase 1 agreement, but I guess you considered it more important to travel the world talking about unceded land in post-colonial structures than to hold China accountable for its unfair trade practices. I continue to hear from my constituents on concerns over the inability of our trade tools to address massive subsidies from China and other countries that dump products and unfairly enter the U.S. market. In your nomination hearing, you expressed the need for new tools to address these new threats to American industries. Last week, I sent you a letter laying out concerns on the aluminum exclusions. Given the serious concerns raised in the aluminum extrusions case, why are new trade tools not being utilized to initiate an investigation into whether Mexican aluminum extruders received unwrought aluminum for less than the market rate from governments of China and Russia?
Ms. Van Dyne, I'd be happy to respond in writing. I find your approach to this question session to be disrespectful and unserious.
Excellent. All right. I look forward to getting because we haven't really gotten responses at all during this hearing, which I find very frustrating as a member of Congress when we ask questions and the best that we can get is soon and hopeful and optimistic answers. In a recent interview, your former deputy USTR, Sarah Biaki, suggested that the reason the Biden administration did not pursue a Section 301 case against China's industrial subsidies was that the administration felt that it was no longer necessary after passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Shocking to hear that. The Inflation Reduction Act does absolutely nothing to stop China's trade cheating. In fact, the IRA is helping China by maintaining our dependence on them for critical minerals. So given that, will you commit to launching an investigation into China's unfair subsidy practices? And again, please be specific. Soon is not an answer.
Ms. Van Dyne, I'm sure there are issues that we agree on. I don't know what you stand for, and I don't know who your constituents are.
So
but if I can understand better,
will you commit
who
to
you're
launching
championing,
an investigation
then I would be
into
happy to work
China's
with you.
unfair subsidy practices? So you can't answer whether or not you will actually do the job of investigating China's unfair subsidy practices?
No, I choose to engage respectfully with people who will treat me the same
So
way.
you can't
are
give
not.
me an answer on that?
No, I choose not to.
All right, thank you very much. I'll yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Schneider, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador Tai, thank you for joining us and for your patience in working with us through this committee. On a personal level, I appreciate your work, and I'm grateful for the successes you and the Biden administration have delivered. The pandemic demonstrated how U.S. companies are at the forefront of biopharmaceutical innovation, not just in developing the leading COVID-19 vaccines, but also research and deploying cutting-edge diagnostics and therapeutics. I was pleased that the recent ministerial confirmed that the TRIPS waiver would not be extended to diagnostics and therapeutics, robustly defending U.S. IP protections. My district, my constituents, include many of the innovators and researchers who are leading the world in developing the next generation technologies. And they rely on strong U.S. intellectual property protections to ensure their global competitors in China and elsewhere cannot appropriate U.S.-developed technology as their own. Keeping the U.S. at the scientific forefront requires strong protections, and I want to again commend the Biden administration and you, Ambassador Tai, for your tireless work in protecting U.S. innovation. Let me now shift to another topic that you and I have discussed many times, the importance of developing robust supply chains, including planning for and building sufficient resiliency, redundancy, and slack to absorb shocks within supply chains while not breaking. This applies to virtually every industry and associated supply network, but none more so than the medical-related supply chains. We saw during the pandemic how our medical supply chains are exposed and vulnerable to over-reliance on single-sourced inputs, as well as the negative actions by entire countries in a global crisis, as occurred with the People's Republic of China throughout the COVID crisis. During the pandemic and after, we have all talked a lot about ideas like reshoring and friendshoring production of both inputs and finished products, which would also create quality jobs here in the United States. And these challenges, protecting U.S. intellectual property and protecting our supply chains against China, did not end with the pandemic. This year, the biopharmaceutical industry has been rocked by intelligence that a Chinese company, Wuxi Aptech, had transferred U.S. IP to the Chinese government without consent. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that Wuxi's Chinese operations are a critical node in the development of as many as 1 in 4 drugs used in the United States, and now the industry is scrambling to address the consequences of the expected removal of Wuxi from supply chains, highlighting the need to shift our focus on trading with friends rather than turning to companies in China. As she noted a few minutes ago, Ms. Steele, I joined with my friend and fellow Ways and Means colleague, Michelle Steele, to introduce H.R. 4307, the Bipartisan Medical Supply Chain Resiliency Act. This legislation will empower the USTR to negotiate trade agreements with respect to medical goods with trusted trade partners who will commit to working with us during public health emergencies and not cut us out of supply chains like China did during COVID. The premise of our bill is that in the globalized economy, when the United States can count on our friends and vice versa, we are all better together. Working with friends who share our interests and values ensures that critical medical supplies get to patients in the United States and around the world in proper time and sufficient quantity, irrespective of unforeseen circumstances. So in the minute or so left, can you please share your thoughts regarding the ongoing geopolitical risks to our supply chains posed by China and potentially other nations, and discuss how the administration is thinking strategically to ensure robust and secure supply chains into the future?
Thank you so much, Mr. Schneider. And I would just note, with respect to Wuxi Aptech, I just saw a report earlier this morning that not only has there been unauthorized transfer of American IP to China, but unauthorized access of Americans' genetic information and data.
Personal details.
Indeed. And so there are multiple dimensions of these concerns that affect our economy and our individual citizens and their privacy rights as well. The issue of supply chain concentration and over-reliance is a significant one, and is actually a reflection of the version of globalization we have today. The incentive structures for firms in their production decisions, in the relationships that they have formed in supply, manufacture. We are very much concerned about the role that USTR can play to set new incentives, to create incentives for our producers, the people who are so critical in the different links in our supply chains, especially in this sector, to make decisions that are not just based on maximizing efficiency. Efficiency is still important and always will be, but also to incentivize resilience. So that, to your point about redundancy and slack, so that there is a plan B and a structure that's built into their business models. This is where it's all at. This is about applying the lessons very, very painfully learned over these past 5 to 7 years and ensuring that the global economy, the U.S. role in the global economy going forward is one that is strong, that doesn't suffer catastrophic breaks in the way that we've experienced, and that allows us the opportunity to have that strength and resilience that's so critical to the experience of our people.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for the extended time. I yield back. The gentleman's time has expired. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ambassador Tai, I'm concerned about the total lack of ambition from this administration on trade policy. It feels like we're asleep at the wheel while China and other competitors pursue an aggressive trade policy abroad that divides up the world's consumers for their farmers, manufacturers, and workers. Whether it be efforts to make trade woke or surrendering U.S. leadership on digital trade, the Biden administration has put progressive activists at the center of the president's trade agenda, all while creating a void that is allowing China to pursue an aggressive global trade that undermines our economic interests and national security. We need our tariff policy to make sense. I want to take a quick moment to highlight 2 companies with domestic manufacturing in my district. One is the Brunswick Corporation, the largest recreational boating company in the world. The other is ASO, the largest manufacturer of adhesive bandages in the United States, producing over 3 billion bandages a year. I will note with other colleagues, it was actually a letter Mr. Schneider and I did together. We sent a bipartisan letter to you on December 22nd, 2023 about Brunswick and the issues they're facing in my district and others. And the response from your office really didn't address the issues. We need action taken now. I will submit both the letter we sent, Mr. Schneider and I sent, as well as the letter that you replied with for the record. Back to these two companies creating jobs in my district. Both of these companies are major domestic job creators, yet have difficulty acquiring materials and resources in the United States, requiring them to acquire limited raw supplies from China to bring to our country to manufacture with U.S. jobs. For Brunswick, their competitors are all from Japan and not subject to these tariffs, but are put at an unfair advantage with foreign competition despite being the company creating jobs right here at home. For ASO, their competitors produce their bandages in China or Brazil and import products ready for distribution using the same fabric ASO does and are not subject to the duties and taxes placed on this U.S. company. U.S. policy focus on these companies hampers domestic production, potentially at the expense of American workers, while having little to no meaningful impact on addressing unfair Chinese trade practices. We must combat unfair Chinese trade practices, and I believe that targeting the recreational motor industry and medical supply industry within these efforts is an unintended consequence of that effort. I'm also very concerned about the global proliferation of digital services taxes. These taxes are clearly discriminatory and unfairly target U.S. companies. That is why I supported the Trump administration's Section 301 investigations. Given the discriminatory nature of these DSTs, I was very surprised to see the Biden administration unilaterally terminate these investigations, eliminating U.S. leverage without concrete assurances that discriminatory DSTs will be eliminated. I am now seeing concerned reports out of the European Union about a potential EU-wide DST, and Canada is pursuing its own unilateral DST. The Biden administration has failed to pursue aggressive action, and it's upsetting that you are just letting our U.S. companies be discriminated against. I believe you need to have new Section 301 investigations and use the tools that Congress has given you to show other countries their consequences for unfair trade practices. Like many of my colleagues, I believe we need to fully enforce the USMCA to ensure that American workers receive the full benefit of that agreement. One area where Mexico is falling short is the pharmaceutical sector. Mexico has yet to fully implement key commitments in the USMCA. Intellectual property chapter and continues to delay regulatory approval and therefore market access for innovative medicines. This not only undermines American jobs and exports, but makes it more difficult to strengthen medical supply chains in North America. USTR needs to use all tools necessary to bring Mexico into compliance with these commitments. I yield back the remainder of my time, and I recognize Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. Ambassador Tai, again, for, for joining us today. Ambassador, something that concerns me greatly is the Chinese government's interest in replacing the United States as the preeminent power in the Indo-Pacific region. One sign of proof that China wants to replace the United States and achieve economic hegemony in Asia is that their recent application to join the Comprehensive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships, CPTPP. This trade agreement was previously negotiated by the United States and 10 other allies, as you know, and it was explicitly designed to exclude China and develop strong standards on IP protection, labor, investment, governance, and dispute settlements to ensure that the Asia-Pacific economy would be shaped in a pro-U.S. image for the foreseeable future. Of course, now that the U.S. is out of the picture, China wants to join. They're in the proverbial waiting room. My question to you, would China joining the CPTPP be a good or bad thing for U.S. economic and national security interests? Simple yes or no would be great.
Mr. Moore, I don't want to disappoint you, but simple yes or no is challenging here, especially given the history of TPP and the history of this committee with TPP. TPP was a challenging, ambitious agreement on the framework of our traditional FTA practice. And it generated a lot of controversy during the negotiation, and of course, it was an American president who took us out of it. So I think the question is a fair one, which is what do we do now? Whether China joins the CPTPP is up to the existing CPTPP partners. Our engagement in the Indo-Pacific is about forming different kinds of supply chains. One of our concerns is that our partners there not further entangle themselves in existing supply chains, but look to build new supply chains with us. So I guess what I would say is, in terms of what is relevant to us, it's about advancing this diversification program with our partners in Asia, in Latin America, and all around the world to make for stronger and more autonomous trading systems.
I know yes or no questions aren't ever necessarily even done. I get there's context. I mean, but given the list of the reasons that it was established, and China is not a fair player in any of those categories, intellectual property, things like that. The point of the question is it good for U.S. national interests? Regardless of whether we're in it or not, is it good for U.S. national interests? And I would argue that it's not. As you may recall, I wrote you in August of last year to highlight significant concerns about Health Canada's proposed cost recovery scheme for the sale of natural health products, which include dietary supplements. I previously raised that there are broad industry concerns that Canada's scheme will negatively affect the overall dietary supplement industry and in favor the manufacturing of dietary supplements in Canada to the detriment of U.S. manufacturers. U.S. industries believe that the proposed scheme may be in breach of the USMCA. What are you doing to ensure Canada upholds its obligations under USMCA with respect to the manufacture and sale of natural health products so Utah companies in my district can achieve fair market access within Canada?
I'm happy to look into this further. We have a strong relationship with Canada, and there are lots of reasons for that, but the point to having a strong relationship is so that you can work through issues and concerns like this.
What would, we sent a letter in, what would be the best way to interact on this further? As my colleague, Mr. Buchanan, also said, this is important to my district, it's extremely important. It's a strong industry. It's something that strengthens not only our state, but our country. It's a strong export. We do it better, we do it more responsibly than others. We get into the mode of writing letters back here, and I get it, and it's a thing, and I'm from the Republican Party, and the White House is under Democratic control. What can we do to understand where your opinion is, what you and your team are going to do to help? I'm game to do anything.
The title of the job is U.S. Trade Representative, and it's to represent the interests of the entire United States. Have your team reach out to mine. If supplements falls under ag, that'll be under my chief ag negotiator's purview. If it's not, we will find the folks on our team who can help your constituents.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this. And of course, Ambassador Tai, thank you for being here this morning and into the afternoon. And I want to acknowledge your staff as well, especially Doug McCaleb, who's there. I appreciate them taking the time to be here to listen and I'm sure learn. Also want to thank you, obviously, for your service, for your work, for your efforts, especially within the confines of the politics that we're seeing and the policies that are coming out of the White House. I want to thank you for your work at the 13th World Trade Organization, ministerial, the Japan deal, and ongoing negotiations with Kenya and Taiwan. Now, I think it's clear that as demonstrated in your and our work as a committee and in a bipartisan manner on the USMCA, that we support trade deals that support the middle class, increase economic security, raise labor and environmental standards, and have enforcement mechanisms. Unfortunately, though, we haven't seen those types of deals or agreements, at least in this administration. Now, earlier in your testimony, you hearkened back to our nation's trade leadership last century, when U.S. transformed the global economy with freer and a wider trade system. President Biden actually campaigned on restoring multilateralism. However, I don't believe the U.S. has leaned into its role as a leader of the rules-based global trading system. I do appreciate the frameworks that you've set up. I do appreciate that we're practicing right now for these trade deals. And I congratulate you on your efforts to innovate and be creative. Some of the new ways or investment that we've seen from legislation that we passed, from CHIPS, IRA, and the IIJA, including the announcement today, $6.4 billion to Samsung for production properties in Texas. Technology protections and even unilateral coercion is what we're using. But that isn't getting rid of tariffs. It isn't ensuring SPS are based on science, and that doesn't allow market access. And I do believe that if we want to incentivize countries to implement labor, environment, and enforcement mechanism, It takes more. It takes deals, it takes multilateralism, it takes FTAs, and it does take working with Congress. I know it's a tough environment. We've had COVID, you have war in Ukraine, Middle Eastern shipping issues, supply chain issues, but I also think there are some inconvenient truths that are out there as well that you really haven't hit on in your testimony today. Many countries can't pass the litmus test of the USMCA. Moreover, they won't do it on their own to keep up with the rising tide. So you're seeing a reduction of trade deals with countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Angola. And also, politics are just not with us on trade. We see that on both sides of the aisle. No matter the agreement, the framework, no matter how worker-centric they are, no matter the benefit to the U.S. global economy and our security agenda, there is a perception that trade is toxic. And what we don't want is for us to be sitting on the sidelines just because of that perception. We want to make sure that we're a part of the economic integration that's going on right now, as we're seeing in the Pacific, especially as China tries to fill that void with its being a part of the CPTPP and RCEP. So I do believe that if we want to use trade to further our goals economically and security-wise, we need more. We need the quid pro quo of a trade deal. We need tariffs to be reduced, we need access to markets, and yes, we need Congress to be involved. I know you like sports analogies, and so I believe that we're good. There's practice players and there's game players. I know you're both. I think it's time that we as a country start to get into the game with our trade deals. Now, when it came to the USMCA, we were players. There was an agreement where market access contributed to the leverage in negotiations. However, we're seeing our administration step away from offering market access as a tool for leverage, and I worry that it has undermined our ability to support both labor and environmental standards. Are there negotiations going on right now in which this year in 2024, basically we've been able to offer that, to have other nations raise their labor and environmental standards?
The short answer is yes, Mr. Panetta. I guess what I just wanted to say is, with respect to your worldview on trade, there are things we agree on, there are things that we don't agree on. One aspect of it is we need to remember who we are. We are the United States of America. We are the largest and strongest economy in the world right now. We should not have to apologize for requiring others to meet our standards in order to access our market. We hold the most valuable market of consumers in the world. If we forget that, we shortchange our people. We shortchange the economic opportunity that we and our people deserve. And I think that's a fundamental shift in thinking about trade and trade deals that's necessary for us to appreciate what our role in the world economy is.
Madam Ambassador, I agree with you. I don't think we need to apologize, but I do think we need to be realistic about the quid pro quo that goes into the trade deals that can actually have an impact, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Tai, for being here. I have the second largest ag district in the country, corn, soybeans being the priority, along with cattle, hogs, dairy, eggs, you name it, turkeys. First of all, I just want to say, do everything you can on the Mexico issue on GMO corn. I mean, 40% of our corn exports to Mexico. I can't tell you how big of an issue this is, and there's a lot of worry in the markets right now where this is headed. The downward pressure in the commodity market on corn is reflecting this issue with corn, got below 4 just about a month ago. That also brings up the topic, and you've heard from everybody about market access. I get that, and I heard all your points. But it really affects ag, especially when you talk about corn and soybeans and pork and dairy and cattle. The downward pressure on the commodity markets. I heard what you said about the trade deficit, that it's got ebb and flows. But here's my issue, is that we're seeing individual states doing individual trade deals with different countries. And I struggle to square this up. If other countries can do this with individual states, why can't our federal government do some of this? And I'd like you to answer that. I mean, why are we lagging behind, especially even our global partners? I mean, our global partners, China has done 10 new agreements, Japan has done 7 new agreements, the EU 8, Canada 8, and we haven't done anything since the last USMCA. So could you expound on that?
Thank you, Mr. Feenstra, and appreciate the significant footprint your district has in our nation's agricultural production. I think this is a fair question. It's one that I come upon quite often, so I'm always willing to engage. The first place is just to assert that you and I are on the same team with respect to U.S. farmers and agricultural producers, the big ones all the way to the small family farmers. They feed us, they are able to feed the world. The second piece is to look at the way that we've done trade traditionally. And you've heard me say we need to do trade in a way that stops pitting Americans against other Americans. One of the things about the traditional free trade agreement is that it has done very, very well for ag, American ag, especially big ag. But it's actually not done well for our heavy industries, our industrial workers. And that's created this, this pitting of Americans against each other. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to continue to score wins for American ag. Yeah. We've done it with India, we've done it in these singles and our doubles, but at the same time what we need to do is stand up for our industries, because the FTAs that we've negotiated have been much more strategic for farmers than the industries.
Thank you. And I hear that, American for Americans, and it's a bit rhetorical rhetoric there. I struggle with it. I struggle with it because no one in the ag industry is seeing a lot of it's, nothing's getting done, and you know, that's where our commodity markets struggle, and it's serious. I want to switch gears. I also share concern with my colleagues on USTR's decision related to digital trade rules. Without the longstanding digital trade rules, local data storage requirements will proliferate, and countries will essentially require U.S. companies to invest in building facilities in those countries as requirement for them to do business there. This creates significant implications for our tax base, our economy, our companies' taxable profits are shifted to other countries. You know, you talk about American and American. Can you expound on this? Ambassador Tai, did you consult with the Treasury on the economic and tax implications of your decision on digital trade here?
So, Mr. Feenstra, I've made this point a couple times, so I definitely want to make sure that I make it to you, which is actually the actions of the U.S. Congress that were most powerful in indicating to us that our digital trade provisions related to data flows, data localization, to your point, storage, and also with respect to source code are outdated. They do not reflect the level of debate that is happening up here in the Congress. Not about national security. We're all on the same page there. Not about Americans' need to have rights to their data, rights to their privacy. But with respect to these digital provisions, they don't take into account the interests of Americans, American citizens, and a regulatory structure that is lagging behind where the technology is. So that's why we have pulled back on those proposals. We are absolutely interested in advancing new, more modernized proposals that give Congress the space to actually legislate.
Thank you for your comments, but just a quick note. I always want to remind everybody that businesses create jobs, businesses create the economy, all right? And that's lost in this administration, and it's lost in these rules, and I'm very scared about that, and we all should be. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Malliotakis.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Tai. I appreciate you being here today. You know, since I've come on this committee, I've really made it a priority to address the supply chain issue as it relates to our pharmaceuticals. I think everybody on this committee agrees that it is very dangerous for us to rely overwhelmingly on Communist China for our pharmaceuticals. As a matter of fact, one of our biggest issues right now is that there are 252 drugs that are currently in shortage in the United States with no pattern or predictability. And India and China manufacture, as you know, active pharmaceutical ingredients that make up about 60 to 70% of the generic drugs in the United States. Chinese API prices have more than doubled since 2020. China is the leading source for U.S. pharmaceutical imports, and China is the leading source of the API that even India uses in its drug production. Over 80% of all APIs for essential medicines are used in the U.S., have no domestic manufacturing source. And over the past 20 years, pharmaceuticals went from the 9th most imported good to the 2nd most imported good. Now, obviously, we oversee tax and trade on this committee. I'm introducing legislation soon that would try to onshore a lot of our pharmaceutical production. But as it relates to trade, you know, China also accounts for 95% of our ibuprofen, 91% of hydrocortisone, 70% of some other, 40 to 45% of penicillins. So what can we do from the trade aspect? And is this something that you are actively speaking within this administration?
Yes, this is an incredibly important issue, and I've noted the interest on this committee, and I think that a logical next step is to find an appropriate forum or convening so that we can sit down and continue the work. But Ms. Malliotakis, yes, we are working on this on an interagency basis, but from a trade perspective as well. We have a supply chains exercise going this year that identifies 11 critical sectors, and medicines API is one of them.
Okay, what countries do you potentially see opportunity? So for example, we recently visited Poland. I mean, that's a country that's like-minded. We are in agreement on so many issues and values. They seem to be producing pharmaceuticals. Ireland's another opportunity. Again, obviously, we want to try to onshore as much as we can using various incentives to level the playing field. But from the trade perspective, where we can't onshore, we want to at least friendshore. Do you see any countries in particular that you think could be capable of working with us?
Let me just endorse your onshoring and friendshoring combination in terms of seeing that as the solution. Our thinking is very much aligned. In terms of good candidates, let me just put it this way, my mind is very open. You have probably done more due diligence and footwork in your visits. I'd be delighted to take on board what you found in your travels.
Okay. Well, I really would, in your role, I think it's critical that you play a really instrumental part in trying to identify those countries where we can have these types of arrangements. And I really urge you to urge the president to talk about this. I mean, it's shocking that the president of the United States does not talk about the need to bring pharmaceutical manufacturing home, or at least not rely on communist China. I mean, this is potentially very, very dangerous. And not hearing the president talk about this in a post-COVID world, right, where we know we need to have our pharmaceutical supply chain shored up and all of that, it's incredible to me that there's been no mention of this. So it's great that we're talking about it. We talked about it before when you've visited the committee. I think we really need to take action now, and as our leading trade ambassador, really appreciate your leadership on this. And we, the committee, will help and work with you however we can to get it done. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have 4 votes on the floor right now, so we will recess and reconvene immediately following the vote series. So this committee stands in recess until the votes are done.